Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The dust motes danced in the late afternoon light filtering through the attic's single window, each speck a tiny performer in the stale air that hadn't been disturbed in months. I'd been putting off this task since Mom passed. Sorting through her belongings felt like archaeology, each box a layer of sediment from a life I thought I knew completely. The house creaked around me, settling into evening with the familiar groans of old wood and loose joints. That's when I found it, wrapped in a yellowed bedsheet behind a stack of Christmas decorations that hadn't seen daylight since the Clinton administration. The mirror was heavier than I expected, its ornate bronze frame tarnished to an almost black patina. Victorian, maybe earlier. The glass itself seemed oddly pristine despite its age, reflecting my sweaty face with unsettling clarity. A folded piece of paper had been tucked behind the frame, held in place by a thin wire. My mother's handwriting, though shakier than I remembered. Look only last. The sequence must be exact. Living room on, kitchen off, bedroom on, bathroom off, hallway on, only when the reflection descends. I turned the paper over, searching for more explanation, but found only a date from 3 years ago, shortly before Mom had started showing signs of the confusion that would eventually consume her final months. The mirror had probably been banished to the attic during one of her episodes, as Dad had diplomatically called them. Standing there in the dim attic, I felt the weight of the mirror in my hands and the weight of the house around me. Since inheriting the place 6 months ago, I'd been living here alone, trying to decide whether to sell or stay. The isolation was getting to me. I'd catch myself talking to empty rooms, leaving lights on in spaces I wasn't using just to feel less alone. The hallway downstairs seemed like the perfect spot for the mirror. The narrow corridor had always felt cramped and dark, and a good-sized mirror would help open it up, create an illusion of space. I maneuvered it down the steep attic stairs with considerable effort, grateful for the wall-mounted hooks that were already in place. Mom had hung a landscape painting there years ago. The mirror settled into position with satisfying precision, like it had been meant for that exact spot. I stepped back to admire the improvement and froze. The reflection wasn't quite right. In the mirror, I could see down the hallway toward the living room, just as I should. But in the reflected living room, the lamp beside Mom's old armchair was on, a warm golden glow that cast familiar shadows across the reflected walls. I turned to look directly into the living room behind me. The lamp was off. I was certain of it. I'd made a habit of keeping lights off during the day to save on electricity, and I distinctly remembered switching everything off after breakfast. I walked into the living room and flicked the switch. The lamp came on, bathing the room in the same warm light I'd seen in the mirror. But when I returned to the hallway and looked at the reflection again, the mirrored living room was dark. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the light off again. In the mirror, it came back on. This had to be some kind of optical illusion. Old mirrors sometimes had imperfections in the silvering that could create strange effects. I'd read about that somewhere. The angle of the afternoon light combined with the mirror's age was probably causing some kind of reflection from outside, maybe sunlight bouncing off a neighbor's window. But even as I rationalized, my pulse quickened. The house felt different with the mirror in place, as if the geometry of the space had shifted slightly. The hallway seemed longer when I looked at it directly, shorter in the reflection. The proportions were subtly wrong in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on the discrepancies. That evening, I tried to ignore the mirror entirely. I made dinner, watched television, read a few chapters of a paperback thriller. But I found myself glancing toward the hallway, catching glimpses of the reflected space that didn't quite match reality. The differences were small: a shadow that fell the wrong way, a door frame that seemed slightly wider, but they accumulated like splinters under my skin. Around midnight, I decided to test what Mom had written about the sequence. I stood in front of the mirror with the note in my hand, studying the reflected hallway that showed lights in rooms I knew were dark. Living room on. I walked over and flicked the switch. The lamp came on in reality, but in the mirror, it went dark. Kitchen off. The kitchen light was already off, but in the mirror, fluorescent light spilled from the doorway. I left it as it was. Bedroom on. I climbed the stairs and turned on the bedroom light. When I returned to the mirror, the reflected upstairs area was black. Bathroom off. Already off in reality, but glowing softly in the reflection. Hallway on. I reached for the hallway light switch, my hand hovering over it for a long moment. According to Mom's note, this was when the reflection descends. Whatever that meant. I flipped the switch. The hallway light came on above me, casting my reflection sharp and clear in the mirror. But in the reflected hallway behind my image, the light remained off. The reflected space was darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper. And in those shadows, at the far end of the reflected hallway where it met the living room, stood a figure. It was impossible to make out details, just a dark silhouette, human-shaped, but motionless, watching. The figure stood exactly where someone would stand if they were looking down the hallway toward the mirror, toward me. But when I spun around to look directly down the actual hallway, nothing was there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. Behind my reflected image, the hallway stretched empty and dark, exactly as it should have been with the light off. But I could feel something wrong about the image, something that made my skin crawl even though I couldn't identify what it was. I flicked the hallway light off and on several times, watching my reflection appear and disappear, but the sequence had been broken. The reflected space now matched reality perfectly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Over the following days, I found myself obsessively checking the mirror. During the day, it behaved normally, reflecting exactly what stood before it. But in the evenings, the discrepancies would return. Lights that were on would appear off in the reflection, and vice versa. The figure in the shadows became a regular presence, always standing just at the edge of clear vision, always gone when I looked directly. I tried to research the mirror's history, but Mom had never mentioned where it came from. A search through her papers revealed nothing. I called my Aunt Margaret, Mom's sister, but she didn't remember ever seeing the mirror in the house. Your mother collected a lot of strange things toward the end, Margaret told me over the phone, her voice carefully neutral. She was convinced the house was wrong somehow, always moving furniture around, covering mirrors, switching lights on and off at odd hours. We thought it was the dementia. But I was beginning to wonder if Mom had been trying to tell us something else entirely. The sleepless nights were taking their toll. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle around me, hearing creaks and whispers that might have been wind through loose siding or might have been something else. During the day, I'd catch myself checking over my shoulder, certain I'd glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. The sequence became a nightly ritual. I'd wait until after midnight, then carefully follow Mom's instructions, watching as the reflected world stubbornly refused to match reality. Each time I completed the sequence, the figure would appear, growing slightly clearer, slightly more defined. It wore clothes, dark pants, a light-colored shirt. Male, I thought, though it was hard to be certain. Average height, average build. It could have been anyone, or no one at all. 2 weeks after hanging the mirror, I decided to break the sequence deliberately. Instead of turning the hallway light on last, I left it off and turned on the bathroom light instead. The reflected bathroom remained dark, but something new appeared in the reflection. Not the usual figure, but movement in the reflected living room. The lamp beside Mom's chair was on in the reflection, and in its glow, I could see someone sitting in the chair. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was clearer than ever before, a man in his 60s wearing clothes I recognized. My father's clothes. Dad had been dead for 5 years. I ran to the living room, my heart hammering. The chair was empty, of course. No light, no figure. Just the familiar furniture arranged exactly as Mom had left it. But when I returned to the mirror, he was still there, sitting calmly in the reflected chair, looking directly at me. His mouth was moving, as if he were speaking, but I couldn't hear anything. I pressed my ear to the mirror's surface, the cold glass shocking against my skin. For just a moment I thought I heard something, a whisper, too faint to understand. Then the reflection returned to normal. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair across from the mirror, watching it like a security guard, waiting for something to happen. The reflected hallway remained perfectly ordinary, matching reality in every detail. As dawn light filtered through the windows, I felt foolish and exhausted. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe I was following in Mom's footsteps, seeing things that weren't there, creating patterns and meaning where none existed. Grief did strange things to people. Isolation did strange things. The combination of both, in a house full of memories and shadows, could easily push someone toward what? Madness? Or toward seeing something that had always been there, waiting? That afternoon I called a glass company to ask about removing the mirror. The technician who answered sounded bored and professional until I described the mirror's size and apparent age. Victorian bronze frame, heavy glass. Listen, if that's authentic, you're looking at some serious money. Antique mirrors like that can be worth thousands, especially if they've got any provenance. After hanging up, I stood in front of the mirror again, studying my reflection. My face looked thinner than I remembered, older. The isolation was definitely getting to me. But as I stared, I noticed something else. My reflected eyes looked different. Not the color or shape, but the expression. While I felt tired and confused, my reflection looked knowing, like it understood something I didn't. I blinked hard and looked again, just tired eyes and a tired face, nothing more. That night, I performed the sequence one last time. I told myself it would be the last time, that tomorrow I'd have the mirror removed and get on with the business of living. But as I turned on the hallway light and saw the figure appear once more in the reflected shadows, I realized that removing the mirror wouldn't solve anything. Because for the first time I was certain I recognized the figure. It was me, or rather, a version of me. Wearing clothes I owned but hadn't put on today. Standing in a hallway that was my hallway, but wasn't quite right. The figure raised its hand in a small wave, and despite myself, I found my own hand rising to wave back. In the glass between us, my reflection waved too, but not at me, at the figure in the reflected hallway. 3 versions of myself, all slightly different, all acknowledging each other across impossible distances. I stepped away from the mirror and walked to the living room, where I sat in Dad's chair and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The house was quiet around me, but not empty. I could feel the weight of all the lives that had been lived here, all the moments that had accumulated in the walls and floors and ceilings. Mom's note said to look only last, but I was beginning to understand that I'd been looking all along. The mirror hadn't shown me something new. It had shown me something that was already there. Something I'd been seeing out of the corner of my eye for months, without realizing it. The question wasn't whether what I was seeing was real. The question was whether reality was as simple as I'd always believed. I'm still living in the house. The mirror is still hanging in the hallway. Most nights, I follow Mom's sequence, and most nights, the reflection dissents. I've stopped questioning whether it's real or imagined. Instead, I've started wondering if maybe there's no difference between the two. After all, in a house full of memories, who's to say which version of the past or the present is the true one? Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself having conversations with the empty rooms again. But now I'm not so sure they're empty, and I'm not so sure I'm alone. Story 2. The first photograph appeared on a Tuesday morning while I stirred sugar into my coffee. The smart screen embedded in my refrigerator door flickered, displaying what I initially mistook for a screensaver, a bird's eye view of my kitchen, captured from an impossible angle near the ceiling. In the image, I stood at the counter, coffee mug halfway to my lips, frozen in digital amber. The timestamp read 7:23 a.m. I glanced at the microwave clock, 7:22 a.m. My hand trembled, sending ripples across the coffee's surface. The photograph vanished, replaced by the usual weather widget and grocery reminders. I convinced myself it had been a glitch. Some malfunction in the appliance's software, perhaps pulling random stock images from the internet. These smart devices were notorious for their quirks. But the explanation felt thin, even as I clung to it. The second photograph materialized 3 days later during dinner. I was eating leftover pasta, scrolling through my phone, when movement on the refrigerator screen drew my attention. Another aerial shot, this time of my dining room table. In the image, I sat hunched over the same bowl of pasta, phone in hand, wearing the exact clothes I had on. The timestamp, 8:47 p.m. The actual time, 8:46 p.m. 1 minute, always 1 minute ahead. I stood slowly, chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed in the silence, amplified by my heightened awareness. I approached the refrigerator, studying the screen's reflection of my own face, pale, drawn, eyes wide with growing unease. The photograph had already disappeared, leaving only the standard interface. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Hidden cameras, though I'd searched every inch of my house after the first incident and found nothing. Hacking, though the photos showed angles that no conventional camera could achieve. Hallucinations, though I'd never experienced anything like this before. The third photograph shattered my remaining skepticism. I was brushing my teeth before bed, foam dripping into the bathroom sink, when I heard the refrigerator's notification chime echo from the kitchen. Against every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, I rinsed my mouth and walked barefoot across the cold tiles. The screen displayed another impossible image. My bathroom, captured from directly above, showing me standing at the sink with toothbrush in hand. But in the photograph, I wasn't alone. A shadow stretched across the bathroom floor, a human silhouette cast by no visible source, extending from the doorway where I now stood. The timestamp read 11:34 p.m. The time was 11:33 p.m. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. The bathroom behind me was empty, illuminated only by the vanity lights. No shadow, no presence, nothing but my own paranoia and the lingering taste of mint toothpaste. Sleep became elusive. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Creaks and groans that had never seemed ominous before now sounded like footsteps, like breathing, like whispered conversations in rooms I couldn't see. Every 30 minutes I crept to the kitchen to check the refrigerator screen, but it remained normal, cycling through its programmed displays. The fourth photograph appeared during my lunch break the following day. I worked from home, a freelance graphic designer with deadlines that kept me tethered to my computer for hours at a time. I'd microwaved a frozen meal and was eating mechanically while reviewing client feedback when the notification chimed. This time, I almost didn't look. Almost. But the compulsion was stronger than my fear. The image showed my home office from above, capturing me hunched over my desk with a fork suspended halfway to my mouth. But something was wrong with the lighting. In the photograph, the room appeared darker, as if photographed during dusk rather than midday. The shadows fell at unnatural angles, and in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was something that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing in the doorway, featureless and indistinct, like a person-shaped void. I checked the timestamp, 1:17 p.m. The current time, 1:16 p.m. My appetite vanished. I pushed the meal away and spent the next hour researching everything I could about smart appliances, surveillance systems, and inexplicable phenomena. The internet offered no explanations that didn't sound absurd. Forums discussed similar experiences, but they read like fiction or the ramblings of unstable minds. I wasn't unstable. I was logical, methodical, grounded in reality. Wasn't I? The photographs began appearing more frequently. Every day brought new images, each one minute ahead of real time, each one revealing details that gnawed at my sanity. I saw myself cooking dinner, while shadows moved independently of any light source. I saw myself watching television while something tall and thin stood behind my couch, just out of focus. I saw myself working, while shapes shifted in the periphery of the frame. Never quite clear enough to identify, but always wrong, always impossible. I stopped eating meals in the kitchen. I unplugged the refrigerator, but the screen continued to function, powered by some internal battery I couldn't locate. I covered the screen with black tape, but somehow the photographs continued to appear, superimposed over the darkness like double exposures. I called the manufacturer, but the customer service representative insisted that the model I described didn't exist, that their smart refrigerators didn't have the capability to take photographs. The shadows in the images grew bolder, more defined. What had started as barely perceptible movements became distinct silhouettes that lurked in doorways, stood behind furniture, or pressed against windows from the outside. They never appeared in my direct vision, only in these prophetic glimpses of moments I hadn't yet lived. I began leaving the house during the times the photographs predicted, thinking I could break the cycle. But when I returned, the refrigerator showed me new images, photographs of my empty house, where the shadows wandered freely through rooms I'd abandoned. They opened cabinets, sat on my furniture, and stood vigil in corners, waiting for my return. Sleep became impossible. Not just because of fear, but because of a growing certainty that sleep itself was dangerous. The shadows in the photographs moved most boldly when I was unconscious, unaware, vulnerable. I survived on caffeine and anxiety, propping my eyelids open with sheer willpower. But exhaustion was a tide I couldn't hold back forever. 3 weeks after the first photograph, I found myself standing in the kitchen at 3:17 a.m., swaying with fatigue, staring at the refrigerator screen. The latest image showed my bedroom from above, the bed empty but rumpled, blankets twisted as if I'd been tossing restlessly. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the photograph's strange lighting, stood a figure more solid than the others. Humanoid but wrong, too tall and thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. The timestamp read, 3:18 a.m. I had 1 minute to decide whether to sleep or to continue my vigil. 1 minute to choose between the exhaustion that was slowly killing me and the unknown fate that awaited in unconsciousness. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, each step echoing in the silence. The room looked exactly as it had in the photograph. Bed unmade, curtains drawn, everything normal except for the creeping sense that I was being watched from every shadow. I sat on the edge of the mattress, hands trembling with caffeine withdrawal and sleep deprivation. The clock on my nightstand read 3:18 a.m. I lay down, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and closed my eyes. For a moment, there was only darkness and the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it. A soft notification chime from the kitchen below, the refrigerator announcing another photograph. But this time, I didn't go to look. This time, I forced myself to remain still, eyes closed, breathing steady, pretending to sleep while every nerve in my body screamed warnings. I felt the weight of observation pressing down on me like a physical presence, felt the air in the room shift and thicken with something that shouldn't exist. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. I kept my eyes closed, maintained the rhythm of sleep breathing, even as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused outside my door. The doorknob turned with a soft click. Hinges creaked as the door swung open. Something entered my room. I felt it watching me, studying me, confirming what the photograph had already revealed. I was asleep. I was vulnerable. I was exactly where and when the image had predicted I would be. The presence moved closer to the bed, and I realized with crystalline clarity that this moment, this exact moment, was what the photographs had been building toward. All those images of shadows and impossible figures had been leading to this. The moment when I would be photographed sleeping, the moment when I would cross the threshold from observer to subject, from the watcher to the watched. The refrigerator chimed again from the kitchen below, and I knew without looking that it was displaying a new photograph. An image of me lying in bed, eyes closed, blankets pulled up to my chin, looking perfectly peaceful. And somewhere in the frame, captured with digital precision, would be the thing that now stood beside my bed, finally clear enough to see, finally close enough to understand. But I kept my eyes closed, clinging to the illusion of sleep, because I knew with absolute certainty that the moment I opened them, the moment I saw what was taking the photographs, what had been watching me all along. I would never wake up to the reality I'd known before. The notification chime sounded again, and again, and again, each chime marking another photograph, another moment captured, another second of this endless now, where I lay frozen between sleeping and waking, between the world I'd known and whatever waited on the other side of sight. The presence beside my bed remained perfectly still, patient as a portrait, waiting for me to make the choice that would determine which reality I would wake up to, if I woke up at all. The chimes continued, rhythmic as a heartbeat, marking time in a house where time no longer moved in straight lines but in circles, in loops, in photographs that showed futures that became present, that became past, that became photographs again. And I lay there in the center of it all, eyes closed, breathing steady, pretending to sleep while the refrigerator downstairs documented every moment of my surrender to whatever strange mathematics governed this new world I discovered, or that had discovered me. The last thing I remembered before the exhaustion finally claimed me was the soft sound of the camera shutter, not from the refrigerator, but from somewhere much closer, somewhere right beside my ear. Click. Story 3. The painting was heavier than I'd expected. My shoulders ached as I held it against the living room wall, searching for the perfect spot where the afternoon light would catch the brushstrokes just right. The antique landscape, a wedding gift from my late aunt, depicted rolling hills beneath storm clouds, the kind of scene that looked peaceful from a distance but harbored something unsettling in its shadows. I'd been living in the apartment for 3 months, and this was my first real attempt at making it feel like home. The previous tenant had left marks on the walls where pictures once hung, ghost rectangles of cleaner paint that reminded me daily of someone else's life. Now, finally, I was claiming the space as my own. The hammer's echo bounced off the bare walls as I drove the nail deep into the plaster. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. I stepped back to admire my work, adjusting the frame until it hung level. That night I learned about the sound. I'd always been a light sleeper, prone to waking at the slightest disturbance. But this was different. My eyes snapped open in the darkness, and without checking the clock, I knew it was 3:17 a.m. The knowledge sat in my mind like a foreign object, certain and inexplicable. From the living room wall came a low thrumming, barely audible but unmistakably there. At first I dismissed it as pipes settling or the building's ancient heating system groaning to life. But as I lay there listening, the sound took on a rhythm that made my stomach tighten with recognition. Thump, 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 thump. It was a heartbeat. I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot across the cold hardwood floor. The sound grew clearer as I approached the wall where I'd hung the painting. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster, just below the frame's lower edge. The rhythm was unmistakable now, but something was wrong. The beats came too fast, arriving a split second before my own pulse would naturally follow. It was as if my heart was trying to catch up to an echo of itself, always falling behind by 2 beats. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, like being out of step with my own body. I pulled away from the wall, my hand instinctively moving to my throat to feel my actual pulse. Normal rhythm, normal rate. But when I pressed my ear back to the wall, there it was again. My heartbeat, but not my heartbeat, preceding me by those crucial 2 beats. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The next evening, I positioned myself in the living room at 3:15 a.m., determined to understand what was happening. I sat in my armchair with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the wall as if it might offer some visual explanation for the phenomenon. At precisely 3:17, the sound began. This time, I approached it methodically. I moved the painting aside and placed my palm flat against the wall. The vibration was faint, but real, pulsing through the plaster in that same 2-beat advance of my own rhythm. I tried holding my breath, thinking perhaps my circulation was somehow affecting what I heard. but the wall's pulse continued unchanged. I pulled out my phone and recorded the sound, but when I played it back, there was nothing, just the ambient hum of the building and my own breathing. The recording revealed no trace of the rhythmic thrumming that had been so clear to my ears. That's when the real fear crept in. Over the next week, I developed a ritual. Each night at 3:15, I would position myself by the wall, waiting for the sound that only I could hear. I began to notice subtle changes in the rhythm, minor variations that seemed to correspond to my emotional state. When I was anxious, the beats came slightly faster. When I was tired, they dragged, growing deeper and more pronounced. The most disturbing realization came on Thursday night when I measured the gap between the wall's pulse and my own. 2 beats ahead, always 2 beats ahead. But as I sat there focusing intently on both rhythms, I could feel my heart beginning to speed up, trying to close that gap. I jerked away from the wall as if it had burned me. The next morning, I rearranged the living room furniture. I told myself it was spring cleaning, but I knew the real reason. I needed to disrupt whatever connection existed between that wall and my body's rhythm. I moved the couch to block direct access to the spot where the sound was strongest. I repositioned the coffee table and relocated 2 large bookshelves to create a barrier of mass and material between me and the wall. That night, the sound was muffled but still present. Worse, it seemed to be adapting, finding new pathways through the room to reach me. I could feel it resonating through the floorboards, traveling up through the legs of my chair and into my body through my bones. Desperate, I turned to sound itself as a weapon. I gathered every radio I could find, an old AM/FM unit from the kitchen, a battery-powered emergency radio, and a vintage transistor radio I'd inherited from my grandfather. I tuned each one between stations, filling the apartment with layers of static and white noise. The harsh, chaotic sound made my teeth ache, but it was better than the alternative. The cacophony masked the wall's pulse, but only partially. Underneath the electronic static, I could still sense that rhythmic thrumming, like a bass line played too low to consciously hear, but loud enough to feel in my chest cavity. I began sleeping on the couch as far from the wall as possible, surrounded by the hissing chorus of detuned radios. But even there, in the early hours before dawn, I could feel my pulse trying to sync with something it couldn't quite reach. My heart would stutter, skip a beat, then resume its normal rhythm with a flutter that left me breathless and sweating. By the second week, I was researching the building's history online, combing through property records and newspaper archives for any mention of unusual incidents. I found nothing, just decades of ordinary tenants living ordinary lives in the same space where I now felt myself slowly coming apart. I started timing everything. The sound began at exactly 3:17 a.m. and lasted for approximately 43 minutes before fading to nothing. During those 43 minutes, I could feel my cardiovascular system fighting against an invisible influence, my pulse becoming erratic as it tried to match a rhythm that shouldn't exist. The furniture barrier wasn't enough. I added layers of heavy blankets hung from nails, creating a makeshift sound dampening system that made the living room feel like a padded cell. I increased the number of radios to 5, then 7, filling every available outlet with devices broadcasting static at maximum volume. The neighbors began to complain. Mrs. Chen from upstairs knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon, her face creased with concern. She asked if everything was all right, mentioning the constant noise coming from my apartment during the night. I assured her it was temporary, that I was working on a sound project for work. The lie came easily, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. That night, I made a terrible discovery. Despite all my precautions, the furniture, the blankets, the wall of static, when 3:17 arrived, I could feel my heart beginning to align with the wall's rhythm. Not just the 2-beat lag closing, but an actual synchronization starting to occur. For perhaps 10 seconds, our pulses matched perfectly, and in that moment, I experienced something I can only describe as displacement. I was simultaneously sitting on my couch and embedded in the wall itself. I could feel the building's structure around me like a second skeleton, its weight pressing against my consciousness from all directions. The sensation was claustrophobic and expansive at once, as if I was being absorbed into something vast and architectural. When my heart finally stuttered back to its own rhythm, I gasped and found myself alone on the couch, drenched in sweat and shaking. The next day, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching cardiac arrhythmias, sleep disorders, and auditory hallucinations. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, then canceled it, then rescheduled it again. How could I explain that my apartment wall was trying to steal my heartbeat? I measured the distance between my couch and the wall. 14 feet. I moved the couch back another 3 feet, then 5 more. By Friday, I was sleeping pressed against the opposite wall, but the sensation of synchronization continued to grow stronger. Saturday night brought a new revelation that shattered what remained of my rational worldview. At 3:17 a.m., as I sat rigidly upright against the far wall with 7 radios screaming static around me, I felt the synchronization begin earlier than usual. But this time, instead of my heart speeding up to match the wall's rhythm, I felt the wall's pulse slowing down to meet mine. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't trying to impose its rhythm on me anymore. We were meeting somewhere in the middle, finding a shared cadence that belonged to neither of us individually. And in that moment of perfect synchronization, I understood with terrible clarity that the wall wasn't just echoing my heartbeat. It was making space for me, creating a hollow in its structure exactly the size and shape of a human body, waiting for me to step inside and become part of the building itself. I jerked my body back into its own rhythm, but the knowledge remained. Every night, the synchronization was lasting a little longer. The space in the wall was becoming more defined, more real. Soon, the choice would no longer be mine to make. Now I sit here at 3 a.m., watching the clock tick toward the inevitable moment. The radios have fallen silent. Their electronic screaming seems pointless now. The furniture I've piled against the wall looks fragile and inadequate, like a child's fort built to keep out monsters that are already inside. I can feel my pulse beginning to change, anticipating the call that will come in 17 minutes. My chest feels hollow, as if my heart is already preparing to relocate, to find its new home in the wall where someone else's echo has been waiting all along. The painting hangs crooked now. I knocked it askew during one of my midnight furniture rearrangements, and I haven't straightened it. In the dim light from the street, the storm clouds in the landscape seem to be moving, gathering above those peaceful hills where shadows hide things that were never meant to be found. 16 minutes now. I can hear my pulse in my ears, and underneath it, something else. A hollow tapping from inside the wall, patient as a grave and twice as deep. I've been thinking about the previous tenant, about why they left those ghost rectangles on the walls, about whether they hung heavy paintings that require deep nails driven into plaster that might disturb whatever sleeps behind the surface, about whether they heard the sound at 3:17 a.m., felt the synchronization beginning, and fled before the wall could finish making space for them. 15 minutes. My heart is already starting to race. Story 4. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I pulled into the gravel lot of Station 47, my headlights cutting through the October darkness like tired knives. Another overnight shift at this godforsaken outpost. Another 12 hours of monitoring equipment that rarely needed monitoring in a building that shouldn't exist this far from civilization. The digital clock on my dashboard read 11:30 p.m. as I killed the engine, but something felt wrong about that simple number glowing green in the darkness. 20 minutes early, just like always. Habit kept me punctual, even when punctuality meant nothing out here in the middle of nowhere, where the nearest town lay 40 miles south, and the nearest neighbor was probably a family of deer. I grabbed my toolbox and thermos, the metal handle cold enough to bite through my work gloves, and trudged toward the single-story concrete building that housed more computing power than most small cities. The night air carried that particular stillness that comes before snow, thick and expectant, pressing against my eardrums like cotton. My boots crunched on frost-brittle leaves as I approached the entrance, where motion sensors should have triggered the exterior floods. Instead, Darkness wrapped around the building like a shroud, broken only by the pale glow seeping through reinforced windows. Inside, the warmth hit me immediately, along with something else, a heaviness that seemed to settle between my shoulder blades. The building felt too quiet, even for a place designed to run itself. No hum of ventilation systems, no whisper of hard drives spinning, just the steady pulse of LED indicators painting the walls in blues and greens and reds. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal, which was normal out here, but the time display made me pause. 11:42 p.m. Had I really spent 12 minutes walking from the parking lot? The distance couldn't have been more than 50 yards, and I hadn't dawdled. The control room stretched before me, banks of monitors displaying readouts from sensors scattered across 3 counties. Weather data, seismic measurements, atmospheric pressure, all the invisible forces that shape the world reduced to numbers scrolling endlessly down dark screens. I settled into the worn chair at the central console and began my routine checks, muscle memory guiding my fingers across familiar controls. That's when I noticed the clocks. Every timepiece in the room, the digital display on the main computer, the LED readout on the backup system, the old analog wall clock my predecessor had installed, all showed 23:42. All of them. The seconds weren't even ticking forward on the digital displays. They simply held that single moment like a photograph. I tapped the main computer screen, thinking maybe it had frozen, but the cursor moved responsively across the display. Everything else functioned normally. Data flowed in real time from the remote sensors. Weather patterns updated every few minutes, but time itself had apparently stopped at 18 minutes before midnight. My first thought was power surge. Sometimes electrical anomalies could scramble clocks and timers, though I'd never seen it affect every timepiece simultaneously. I pulled up the system logs, scanning for any indication of power loss or equipment failure, but found nothing unusual. Voltage levels held steady. Backup systems showed green across the board, and the building's main power grid registered no fluctuations for the past week. Still, protocols were protocols. I initiated a controlled restart of all timing systems, watching as screens flickered and displays went dark before slowly coming back online. One by one, the clocks reappeared on their respective screens, each one showing the same impossible time. 23:42. The wall clock's second hand had resumed its steady sweep, but instead of advancing toward 23:43, it completed its circuit and started again, tracing the same 60-second journey like a hamster on a wheel. I stood close enough to hear its mechanism, the tiny click of gears and springs working exactly as they should, except they weren't working toward anything. I tried adjusting the system time manually, but the computer rejected every input. Error messages flashed briefly. Temporal synchronization locked. External reference required. Time source unavailable. Technical gibberish that told me nothing except that something had gone fundamentally wrong with the way this place perceived reality. The rational part of my mind suggested calling for backup, but my phone showed the same frozen time as everything else. Even its internal clock had somehow been infected by whatever was wrong with this place. I could drive to the nearest town and report the malfunction, but that would mean abandoning my post. And 20 years of steady employment had trained me never to abandon my post. Besides, what would I tell them? That time had stopped? That every clock in a government monitoring station had decided to take a coffee break at the same arbitrary moment? They'd assume I'd been drinking or worse, and I'd probably lose my security clearance before the investigation even began. I decided to inspect the backup power systems. Sometimes timing circuits drew from auxiliary sources during maintenance mode, and maybe something had gone wrong during the last scheduled update. The utility room lay down a short corridor lined with more monitors, each one dutifully displaying its own version of 23:42. As I passed the first bank of screens, something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, but saw only my own reflection staring back from the dark surface of a dormant monitor. The fluorescent lights overhead painted harsh shadows under my eyes, making my face look haggard and unfamiliar. I'd been working too many double shifts lately, pulling overtime to pay for the new roof my house desperately needed. Maybe fatigue was finally catching up with me. But as I started to turn away, the reflection seemed to lag for just a moment, as if the mirror version of myself was slightly out of sync with the original. I stopped and waved my hand experimentally. My reflection waved back immediately, perfectly synchronized, and I felt ridiculous for even checking. The utility room's heavy door opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing racks of equipment humming quietly in climate-controlled darkness. Battery backup systems, voltage regulators, and the master timing circuit that synchronized all building operations. Everything looked exactly as it should, green LEDs indicating normal operation across the board. I ran a diagnostic on the timing circuit anyway, watching as the system tested each component in sequence. All checks passed. According to every instrument in the room, time was flowing normally throughout the building. The atomic clock receiver was locked onto the national time standard, the GPS synchronization was functioning perfectly, and the internal crystal oscillators were maintaining their specified frequencies. Yet every clock still showed 23 off 42. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, trying to reconcile the contradiction between what the instruments told me and what my eyes could clearly see. The diagnostic logs showed continuous operation dating back months, with no gaps or errors that might explain the current anomaly. It was as if the building existed in two different realities, one where time flowed normally, and one where it had stopped 18 minutes before midnight. When I returned to the control room, something had changed. The monitors still showed their endless streams of sensor data, but now there was something else visible in their reflective surfaces. Shapes that didn't correspond to anything in the room behind me. Dark silhouettes that seemed to stand just beyond the edge of visibility, like shadows cast by objects that weren't there. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in clouds and figures in random patterns. Working alone in an isolated building at night could play tricks on anyone's perception, especially when fatigue and stress were already clouding my judgment. But as I moved between workstations, the shapes seemed to follow, always remaining just out of direct sight but unmistakably present in the glossy screens. They had no faces. That detail emerged gradually as my eyes adjusted to the subtle interplay of light and reflection. Where faces should have been, there was only smooth darkness, as if someone had erased their features with careful precision. They stood perfectly still, patient as statues, watching from inside the monitors with their impossible eyes. I tried to concentrate on my work, updating logs and reviewing sensor readings, but the figures never disappeared entirely. Sometimes they seemed closer, crowding near the edges of screens like curious children pressing against aquarium glass. Other times they retreated into the electronic depths, barely visible shadows that might have been nothing more than artifacts of the display technology. The building's heating system cycled on with a distant rumble, and I realized how cold the control room had become. My breath formed brief clouds in the stale air, and my fingers were growing stiff despite my work gloves. I checked the thermostat, but it showed a comfortable 72 degrees. Either the sensor was malfunctioning, or my body was responding to something the instruments couldn't measure. I decided to take a break, maybe step outside for some fresh air and perspective. The main entrance lay just 30 feet away, past the reception area with its empty chairs and outdated safety posters. I could see the exit clearly through the reinforced glass doors, the parking lot beyond lit by pale starlight. But as I approached the doors, they remained firmly closed. I pressed the release button beside the frame, and nothing happened. The mechanism didn't even click. I tried the manual override, but the heavy doors felt like they were sealed shut, as if someone had welded them into their frames while I wasn't looking. Through the glass, I could see my truck waiting in the parking lot, so close I could almost touch it, but I might as well have been looking at the moon. The fire exit at the rear of the building was similarly unresponsive. Emergency exits weren't supposed to lock from the inside. It violated a dozen safety codes, but the doors refused to budge no matter how hard I pushed. Even the windows, despite being designed never to open, seemed somehow more solid than they should have been, as if the glass had thickened while I wasn't watching. A low tone echoed through the building, the same sound that usually indicated the end of a system test or the completion of a data upload. But I hadn't initiated any tests, and no uploads were scheduled for the overnight shift. The tone repeated every few seconds, rhythmic and mechanical, like a heartbeat made of electricity. I returned to the control room to find that the figures in the monitors had moved closer. They pressed against the inner surfaces of the screens now, their featureless faces nearly touching the glass from the other side. I could see details that shouldn't have been possible in mere reflections. The texture of fabric, the subtle movement of breathing, the way their heads turned to track my movements across the room. One of them raised what might have been a hand and placed it flat against the screen, fingers splayed like a starfish. The glass began to ripple where the hand touched it. Not like water, but like something more fundamental was bending. The solid surface of the monitor developed small waves that spread outward from the point of contact, and I could swear I felt a pressure change in the room, as if the air itself was being displaced by something pushing through from the other side. I backed away from the monitors, but there were screens everywhere, and the figures appeared in all of them now. Dozens of faceless watchers, all reaching toward their respective barriers, all testing the boundaries between their world and mine. The rippling effect was spreading, monitor screens flexing like drumheads under invisible pressure. The atomic clock on the wall continued its relentless sweep through the same minute, and I finally understood what the figures were waiting for. They weren't trapped behind the glass. They were trapped behind time itself, existing in the spaces between seconds, in the pause between 2342 and 2343. And somehow this building had fallen into that same pause, creating a bridge between their realm and mine. But bridges work both ways. I needed to break the loop, to push time forward past that critical moment when their world and mine overlapped. The atomic clock receiver was the key. It maintained the building's temporal reference point, synchronizing everything to the national time standard. If I could force it to resynchronize, maybe I could jar the whole system back into normal time. The receiver sat in a locked cabinet in the utility room, protected by redundant security systems because accurate timing was crucial for the building's data collection mission. But my access card worked for everything else in the facility, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The cabinet opened with a soft beep, revealing the atomic clock receiver, a device no larger than a hardcover book, covered in indicator lights and adjustment controls. According to the manual I found wedged behind it, forcing a resynchronization required disconnecting the unit for exactly 60 seconds before reconnecting it. The atomic signal was strong enough that the receiver would lock onto the correct time almost immediately. I counted carefully as the unit powered down, watching the figures in the nearby monitor grow more agitated. They pressed harder against their barriers, and the screen developed deep bends like someone pushing on a soap bubble. The 60 seconds felt like 60 minutes, but finally I reconnected the power cable and watched the receiver's LEDs flicker back to life. For a moment, nothing changed. The wall clock continued its endless sweep. The monitors still showed 2342, and the figures remained at their stations behind the glass. Then gradually, the receiver's synchronization light began to blink, indicating it was searching for the atomic time signal. The building shuddered. Not physically. There was no earthquake, no structural movement, but reality itself seemed to hiccup, like a record skipping to the next track. The fluorescent lights flickered in a pattern that hurt to watch, and every electronic device in the building emitted a brief, discordant hum. The clock's second hand stuttered, hesitated, then lurched forward to 2343. The figures in the monitors recoiled as if burned, their forms becoming indistinct and wavering. The screens stopped rippling and returned to their normal solidity, though I could still see vague shapes moving in the electronic depths, now much farther away than before. I ran back to the control room and checked every timepiece I could find. They all showed 2343, then 2344, then 2345. Time was flowing again, carrying me forward into a future that had been momentarily suspended. The building's systems resumed their normal operations, heaters kicking on to warm the suddenly frigid air, ventilation fans stirring the stale atmosphere back to life. But when I tried the doors again, they remained locked. I was still trapped, still isolated in this place that had briefly slipped outside of normal time. And as I watched the monitors, I began to see new figures gathering in the electronic darkness, more distinct now, more purposeful, as if my attempt to escape had only drawn their attention to this particular point in space and time. The wall clock read 23:58. 2 minutes until midnight, 2 minutes until a new day began. I wondered what would happen when the clock reached 0:00, whether the loop would reset and trap me at 23:42 again, or if something worse would occur. The figures in the screen seemed to be waiting for that moment, arranged like an audience anticipating the start of a performance. My phone vibrated against my leg, and I pulled it out with trembling fingers. A text message from an unknown number. "You can't leave until you understand why you're here." But I had never given this phone number to anyone at work, and cellular service didn't reach this far into the wilderness. The message shouldn't have been possible, yet there it was, glowing softly in the artificial twilight of the control room. The clock showed 23:59. As the second hand began its final sweep toward midnight, I realized that breaking the loop hadn't solved anything. It had only bought me time to understand what was really happening. This building, this job, this entire night might have been something else entirely. Something designed to teach me a lesson I didn't want to learn. The figures in the monitors pressed forward again, but now they weren't faceless. Now they wore faces I recognized from my past, from choices I'd made and paths I'd abandoned. They reached toward me not with malice, but with the patient persistence of unfinished business. The clock reached orero, and everything began again. Story 5. The walking stick appeared on a Tuesday, lying beside pump 3 like it had always belonged there. I'd been working the graveyard shift at Morrison's Gas and Go for 8 months, and nothing unusual ever happened between midnight and 6 a.m. except the occasional drunk college kid or trucker needing coffee and directions. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical prayer above me, casting everything in that sickly hospital glow that made even healthy skin look corpse pale. But that Tuesday night, when I stepped outside to clean the windshield fluid dispensers, there it was, an ornate walking stick with a carved ivory handle, its wood dark with age and wear. My first instinct was to take it inside, maybe put up a lost and found notice. Someone would claim it eventually. The handle felt warm in my palm, almost feverish, with intricate engravings that seemed to shift and writhe under the harsh exterior lighting. I brought it inside and propped it against the counter, then went back to reorganizing the energy drink cooler. When I checked 20 minutes later, the walking stick was gone. I searched the cramped interior of the station, behind the Slurpee machine, near the restroom, even in the storage closet that smelled perpetually of old motor oil and cleaning supplies. Nothing. The security cameras showed me carrying it inside at 1:47 a.m., but after that, the footage revealed only empty frames of the counter area, my own movements as I stocked shelves and rang up the occasional customer. But when I stepped outside again at 3:15 for a cigarette break, there it was. Same spot beside pump 3, lying at the exact angle I'd found it originally. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 2 years of community college before financial reality forced me into this job, suggested that maybe I'd imagined bringing it inside. Sleep deprivation could play tricks. Night shift workers were prone to microsleep episodes, brief moments where the brain switched off without warning. Maybe I'd hallucinated the whole thing. I left the walking stick where it lay, but over the next week, the pattern repeated. Every night, there it was, positioned beside pump 3 like a faithful dog waiting for its owner. Every night, I'd pick it up, bring it inside, and every night, it would somehow return to its original position. The security footage was useless. It showed me bringing the stick inside, but never showed it leaving. Worse, the cameras seemed to develop intermittent blind spots, sections where the image would flutter with static, or go completely black for several seconds at a time. By the second week, I'd stopped trying to move it. I'd given up checking the cameras. The walking stick had become part of the landscape, as permanent as the gas pumps themselves or the flickering neon sign that buzzed 24 hours into the empty night. That's when I started noticing the reflection. It began as a peripheral sensation, the feeling of being watched that would crawl up my spine during the dead hours between 3 and 5 a.m. I'd turn toward the windows, expecting to see a customer approaching, or maybe a police cruiser making its rounds. But the parking lot would be empty except for my beat-up Honda Civic and the walking stick lying in its predetermined spot. The feeling intensified over several nights, until I could swear I saw movement in the dark glass of the storefront windows. Not my own reflection. I knew that distorted image well enough after months of catching glimpses of myself in the harsh fluorescent glare. This was something else, a shape that moved independently of my own motions, hovering near the area where I'd propped the walking stick during those first few attempts to bring it inside. Sleep deprivation could explain a lot of things. The human brain, deprived of proper rest and subjected to the unnatural rhythms of night work, could conjure all sorts of phantom images. I'd read about that in one of my psychology textbooks, back when I'd harbored illusions about finishing college and doing something meaningful with my life. Hypnagogic hallucinations, they called them. Perfectly normal for someone in my situation, but hallucinations don't show up on security cameras. I discovered this 3 weeks after the walking stick's first appearance, while reviewing footage from the previous night. The timestamp read 4:23 a.m., and there I was behind the counter, organizing lottery tickets with mechanical precision. The image quality was typical for a gas station security system, grainy, black and white, with motion blur that made everything look vaguely underwater. In the background, near the magazine rack, stood the clear silhouette of an elderly woman. She wore what appeared to be a long coat or dress, her hair pinned up in an old-fashioned style that belonged to decades past. Her posture suggested frailty, the careful way very old people move when their bodies have become unreliable. But what made my hands shake as I watched the footage was the way she moved in relation to the walking stick outside. Every time the woman raised her arm, which she did repeatedly, in a pointing gesture directed toward the far corner of the parking lot, the walking stick would shift slightly, as if responding to some invisible force. The movements were subtle, barely perceptible, but undeniable when viewed frame by frame. I ran the footage back several times, each viewing confirming what my sleep-deprived mind wanted to reject. The woman appeared for exactly 17 minutes, always pointing toward the same area of the parking lot, always in perfect synchronization with the walking stick's movements. Then, at 4:40 a.m., she simply faded away, leaving only the empty magazine rack and my own oblivious figure continuing to arrange lottery tickets. The area she'd been pointing toward was the maintenance access to the underground fuel tanks, a concrete depression surrounded by orange safety cones and covered with a heavy metal grate. The sign posted there read, "Danger, authorized personnel only, confined space." But I'd never seen anyone from the gas company actually access it during my shifts. For 3 more nights, I watched the woman appear on the security footage. Always the same time, always the same pointing gesture, always the same target. Her image grew clearer with each appearance, as if she were somehow gaining substance or moving closer to whatever barrier separated her from full visibility. On the 4th night, she appeared not just on the camera, but in my peripheral vision as well. I was refilling the coffee machines when I caught the movement in the window reflection. My heart rate spiked as I turned, but the magazine rack area appeared empty. Yet when I returned to the coffee machine, she was there again in the glass, pointing, always pointing toward that covered access point. The walking stick outside began to rattle against the concrete, a sound like bones clicking together. I grabbed a flashlight from the utility drawer and stepped outside, the cool October air cutting through my uniform shirt. The woman's reflection followed me, visible now in the window glass and the metallic surface of the gas pumps. She never looked directly at me, never acknowledged my presence, but her pointing gesture had become more insistent, her arm moving with increasing urgency. The metal grate covering the maintenance access was heavier than expected, but years of anxiety-driven gym sessions had left me stronger than my thin frame suggested. It lifted with a grinding shriek that seemed to echo far longer than physics should have allowed. Beneath lay a narrow vertical shaft, maybe 4 feet deep, lined with concrete and filled with shadows that my flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. The ladder rung set into the concrete wall felt solid enough, though the metal was cold against my palms and slick with condensation. As I descended, the sound of my own breathing became amplified, echoing off the close walls like the respiratory system of some vast underground creature. At the bottom of the shaft, My flashlight beam revealed something that shouldn't have existed. Set into the concrete wall was a small alcove, perhaps 2 feet square, that had been carefully bricked up and then broken open again. The broken bricks lay scattered on the narrow floor of the shaft, along with what appeared to be the remains of an old wooden box. Among the debris, glinting in my flashlight beam, was a tarnished silver medallion on a chain. The moment my fingers touched the metal, voices began to whisper. They weren't words exactly, more like the sound of conversation heard through water or from a great distance. Multiple voices, overlapping and indistinct, but unmistakably human. They seemed to emanate from the medallion itself, growing louder as I lifted it from the debris. The whispers followed me as I climbed back to ground level, becoming more insistent with each rung of the ladder. By the time I emerged into the parking lot, they'd resolved into something approaching speech, though the words remained maddeningly unclear. It was like listening to a radio station that was almost, but not quite, in tune. The woman's reflection was waiting for me beside pump 3, standing directly over the walking stick. For the first time since she'd begun appearing, she looked directly at me. Her face was kind but urgent, creased with worry lines that spoke of decades spent caring for others. Her mouth moved as if she were speaking, but no sound emerged except for the whispers emanating from the medallion. I held up the medallion, and her expression shifted to something like relief. She nodded once, then pointed again, not toward the access shaft this time, but toward the far edge of the parking lot where the property line met the old cemetery. Morrison's Gas and Go had been built on land that once formed part of Riverside Cemetery, a fact I'd learned from local customers who enjoyed sharing the morbid history. The gas station occupied what had been a section of paupers' graves, unmarked plots where the town's forgotten poor had been laid to rest in the early 1900s. The remaining cemetery stretched beyond the back fence, its weathered headstones visible through the chain link during daylight hours. Following the woman's pointing finger, I crossed the parking lot toward the rear of the property. She moved with me, her reflection visible in the surface of my car's rear window, always maintaining that pointing gesture. The whispers from the medallion grew more agitated with each step, the overlapping voices rising in volume and urgency. At the fence line, she pointed toward a specific area of the cemetery, a spot marked by a plain granite headstone that stood apart from the others. Even in the poor light, I could make out the carved inscription, Eleanor Hartwell, 1923-1987, beloved mother and caregiver. The medallion grew warm in my palm, and the whispers suddenly resolved into clarity. They weren't multiple voices at all, but one voice repeated and layered, like an audio recording played back over itself dozens of times. The voice was elderly, female, and desperate. "Find my grandson," it said over and over. "Find my grandson. Before sunrise. Find my grandson." I checked my phone. 4:47 a.m. Sunrise was less than 2 hours away. Eleanor Hartwell's grave was perhaps 50 yards from the fence, accessible through a gap where teenagers had cut the chain link years ago. The cemetery at night possessed a quality of silence that seemed to absorb sound rather than simply containing it. My footsteps on the gravel paths sounded muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick and resistant. The headstone was simpler than most, bearing only Eleanor's name, dates, and epitaph. No decorative flourishes, no religious symbols, just the essential facts of a life lived and ended. But at the base of the stone, someone had left offerings, not flowers, but personal items. A pair of reading glasses, their lenses cracked. A small metal toy car, its red paint faded to brown. A photograph in a weatherproof frame showing a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, smiling gap-toothed at the camera. The medallion's whispers had stopped, but its warmth had increased until it was almost uncomfortable to hold. I knelt beside the headstone, unsure of what I was supposed to do. Return the medallion to the grave? Leave it as another offering? The woman's reflection hadn't followed me into the cemetery, and I felt suddenly isolated, cut off from whatever guidance she'd been providing. That's when I noticed the boy. He was standing perhaps 20 feet away, partially concealed by a larger monument topped with a weeping angel. The same boy from the photograph, unchanged by the decades that should have passed since the picture was taken. He watched me with solemn eyes, making no move to approach or retreat, The medallion pulsed with heat in my palm, and I understood. I walked toward the boy, each step feeling like it covered vast distances. He didn't move as I approached, didn't even blink, but his eyes followed my movement with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I was close enough to touch him, though something deep in my survival instincts warned against any such contact, I held out the medallion. His small hand reached for it, and for a moment our fingers almost touched. In that instant, I felt the presence of Eleanor Hartwell beside me, no longer a reflection but a weight in the air, a sense of immense relief and gratitude that brought tears to my eyes. The boy's fingers closed around the medallion, and both he and the presence of Eleanor simply weren't there anymore. Not faded, not dissolved, just absent, as if they had never existed at all. I found myself standing alone in the cemetery as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky. The medallion was gone, and with it the whispers, the warmth, the sense of otherworldly purpose that had driven me through the night. When I returned to the gas station, the walking stick was no longer beside Pump 3. I spent the remaining hour of my shift reviewing the security footage from the night, finding nothing but routine images of an empty gas station and my own solitary figure moving through familiar routines. No woman by the magazine rack, no mysterious pointing gestures, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. The maintenance access grate was sealed and surrounded by safety cones, exactly as it had always been. No signs of disturbance, no broken bricks, no alcove hidden in the concrete walls below. When I called the gas company the next day to ask about recent maintenance work, they assured me that no one had accessed the underground tanks in over a year. I researched Eleanor Hartwell at the public library during what should have been my sleep hours. The obituary confirmed the basic facts from her headstone, but provided additional details that made my hands shake as I read. Eleanor had been a caregiver at the county children's home for over 30 years. She'd taken in foster children throughout her life, including a grandson who'd come to live with her after his parents died in an accident. The grandson's name was Timothy Hartwell. According to the records, he disappeared from Eleanor's home in October of 1987, 3 weeks before her death. His body was never found. The case remained officially open, though no leads had developed in decades. A subsequent search through missing persons databases revealed that Timothy would be 36 years old now if he were still alive. The photograph on Eleanor's grave matched the description from his missing person report exactly. I never saw Eleanor or Timothy again, but sometimes, during the deep hours of my shift when the fluorescent lights seem to dim and the shadows grow longer, I catch myself checking the security monitors more carefully, looking for shapes that move independently of my own reflection, listening for whispers that might emerge from the constant electrical hum that fills the empty spaces of the night. The walking stick never returned, but I keep a flashlight in my pocket now, just in case, because I've learned that some debts transcend death, and some loves endure beyond the boundaries of the rational world. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the parking lot is empty except for my own car in the watching darkness, I can swear I hear an elderly woman's voice carried on the air, faint but unmistakable, saying thank you, over and over until the words fade into the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Whether I saved 2 spirits that night, or simply experienced the most elaborate hallucination of my life, I'll never know for certain. But I sleep better now during my daylight hours, and the persistent feeling of being watched has faded to nothing more than the ordinary paranoia of someone who works alone in the deep hours when the world belongs to shadows and secrets. The boundary between sanity and madness, between the possible and impossible, remains as thin as ever. I've simply learned to live comfortably in that uncertain space, accepting that some questions are more important than their answers, and some stories are true regardless of whether they actually happened. Story 6. The fluorescent lights at the Exxon station buzzed with that particular frequency that always made my teeth ache. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, chasing a lead on a construction contract outside Phoenix, and my Ford pickup needed gas more than I needed sleep. The pump's digital display flickered as premium unleaded flowed into my tank, the numbers climbing in that hypnotic way that makes you forget you're spending money you don't have. That's when I first noticed him. He stood by the air pump, not using it, just watching me with the kind of intensity that made my skin crawl. Middle-aged, wearing a wrinkled gray suit that belonged to a different decade, he kept tilting his head like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. His lips moved constantly, forming silent words that seemed to follow the rhythm of some unheard melody. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not the friendly acknowledgement you'd expect from a stranger at a gas station, but something that made me want to check if my truck doors were locked. He approached with measured steps, his dress shoes clicking against the cracked asphalt in perfect time with the pump's mechanical hum. Up close, I could see the deep circles under his eyes, the way his fingers twitched against his thighs, and most unsettling of all, the fact that he seemed to be mouthing words in sync with something playing in his head. "You hear it too, don't you?" he said, stopping just close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Hear what?" "The music." He pointed directly at my truck, specifically at the passenger side. "Coming from your glove compartment. It's beautiful, isn't it? Like nothing from this world." A chill ran down my spine despite the desert heat. My glove compartment contained nothing but insurance papers and a few pens. No radio, no music player, nothing that could produce sound. "I don't know what you're talking about." But even as I said it, something in his certainty made me strain to listen. The desert wind carried the usual sounds. Distant highway traffic, the ping of cooling metal, the electric buzz of signs. But underneath it all, was there something else? A faint melodic thread that seemed to weave between the ambient noise. "You will," he said with absolute conviction. "Soon." The pump clicked off. In the sudden silence, I thought I caught the tail end of what might have been a tune, so brief and ethereal that I couldn't be sure it wasn't just my imagination filling in the gaps between the wind's whispers. When I looked up from hanging the nozzle, the man was gone. I scanned the gas station, the parking lot, even walked around to check if he'd ducked behind the building. Nothing. He'd vanished as completely as if he'd never been there at all, leaving only the lingering scent of coffee and something else. Something metallic and strange that reminded me of old electronics warming up. Back in my truck, I sat for a moment with the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations. The guy was obviously disturbed, possibly homeless, probably on drugs. Desert gas stations attracted all kinds of drifters and lost souls. His disappearance could be explained by my momentary distraction with the pump. But as I reached for the ignition, I heard it. Soft and distant, like a radio playing in another room, a melody drifted through the cab of my truck. Not from the speakers. My radio was off, and the sound seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. The music had an otherworldly quality, notes that bent and flowed in ways that made my chest tighten with inexplicable longing. My eyes fixed on the glove compartment. The melody grew slightly stronger, as if responding to my attention. It was the kind of tune that felt familiar despite being completely alien, like remembering a dream from childhood. Each note seemed to pull at something deep in my mind, creating harmonies with thoughts I didn't know I was thinking. With trembling fingers, I reached for the glove compartment latch. Inside, nestled among my mundane paperwork like it had always belonged there, sat a radio unlike anything I'd ever seen. It looked ancient, not vintage, but genuinely old, as if it had been crafted by someone who understood electricity but approached it like magic. The casing was made of dark wood that felt warm to the touch, inlaid with symbols that might have been letters in some forgotten alphabet. Instead of a digital display, it had an analog dial marked with numbers that didn't follow any pattern I recognized. The music emanated directly from its single speaker, clearer now that I'd found the source. But this wasn't possible. I'd bought this truck used 3 years ago and had been through the glove compartment hundreds of times. This radio had never been there before. As I lifted it out, the weight felt wrong, too heavy for its size, as if it contained something denser than electronics. The moment my fingers closed around it completely, the music stopped. Silence filled the truck, so complete it made my ears ring. Then, with a soft click that seemed to come from inside the radio itself, a voice emerged from the speaker. "He's going to start the engine now." My hand froze halfway to the ignition key. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the clear diction of a professional announcer. But more disturbing was its matter-of-fact tone, as if it were simply observing rather than predicting. He's looking at the radio with confusion. He's wondering if this is some kind of joke. The accuracy hit me like ice water. Those were exactly my thoughts, playing out in my mind as the voice described them. I jerked my hand away from the radio as if it had burned me. He's afraid now. He's considering leaving the radio here and driving away. The voice was right again. That's exactly what I was thinking. But even as the idea formed, the voice continued. But he won't. He can't. He needs to understand what this is, what it means. He's going to turn the dial. And God help me, I was. Despite every rational instinct screaming at me to throw the thing out the window and drive away, I reached for the dial. My fingers moved without conscious direction, turning it slowly to the right. Static filled the speaker, then cleared to reveal a different voice. Female this time, younger, with a slight southern accent. The construction worker in the blue Ford is about to check his phone. He received a text message 17 seconds ago but hasn't looked at it yet. I pulled out my phone. Sure enough, there was a new message from my foreman about tomorrow's job site. I'd felt the buzz when it arrived, but had been too focused on the radio to check it immediately. Another quarter turn of the dial brought a third voice, this one elderly and crackling like an old recording. He's beginning to understand that time isn't what he thought it was. Past, present, and future are just different frequencies on the same signal. He's tuning into tomorrow. My mouth went dry. I turned the dial again, faster now, desperate to find something normal. Music, news, anything that would break this impossible pattern. But every station brought new voices, all describing actions I was about to take, thoughts I was about to think, with the casual precision of sportscasters calling plays. He's going to try station 7.3. I was already reaching for that position on the dial before the words fully registered. He's realizing he has no choice in any of this. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. Each prediction was coming true not because the voices could see the future, but because they were creating it. Every description was a command, every observation a script I was powerless to deviate from. He's starting to panic. My breathing quickened, chest tightening with the claustrophobia of predestination. If the radio could predict everything I was going to do, then I wasn't really making choices at all. I was just playing out a program someone else had written. He's going to try to smash the radio. My fist was already rising when I caught myself. The prediction had given me a moment of warning, a split second to choose differently. I lowered my hand slowly, feeling like I'd just won a small victory against fate itself. For the first time since I'd heard the first voice, there was silence from the speaker. Then, so faint I almost missed it, a sound like surprised laughter. I turned the dial frantically now, searching through static and whispers for something that would give me back control of my own actions. Each station brought new horrors, voices describing not just my immediate future, but longer-term plans being made for me. The construction worker will receive a call tomorrow offering him a job in Nevada. He'll accept the position and drive west on Interstate 15. 3 days from now, he'll stop at a rest area outside Las Vegas where they'll be waiting. He'll give them the truck, he'll give them the radio. He'll join the others who hear the frequencies. The word them sent terror through my veins. Who were they? How many people had found radios like this one? Had their futures mapped out by disembodied voices? Had surrendered their vehicles and their free will to some unseen collective? I thought about the man at the gas station, his twitching fingers and moving lips. Had he once sat in his own car, listening to his own impossible radio, hearing his own fate described with clinical detachment? My fingers worked the dial desperately, spinning past station after station of my predetermined future. Work assignments I'd never applied for, places I'd never planned to visit, people I'd never met who apparently expected me. Then I found something that made my blood freeze, a voice I recognized as my own, older and tired, speaking with the same matter-of-fact tone as all the others. The new ones always fight it at first. They think they can find the silent station, rewrite their programming. But there is no silence. There are only frequencies we haven't tuned into yet. I stared at the radio in horror. Was this my future self? broadcasting backwards through time? Had I already become one of them? Already surrendered my will to whatever network this radio connected to? Tell them about the silence, another voice interjected. Younger, female, desperate. Tell them there has to be silence somewhere. There is no silence, my older voice replied with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times. There are only the stations we haven't found yet. But we keep looking, don't we? We have to keep looking. I understood then what I had to do. Not find silence, that might be impossible, but find the space between stations, the gap in the programming where my own voice might still exist. I began turning the dial with surgical precision, moving in tiny increments, listening for the dead air between broadcasts. Between each station was a whisper of static, a breath of nothing that might be enough. But even as I searched, voices from previous stations began to bleed through, overlapping predictions creating a cacophony of predetermined futures. He's looking for the silent station. He thinks he can escape the program. He doesn't understand that searching is part of the program too. We've been waiting for him to reach this conclusion. Welcome to the network. The radio grew warm in my hands, then hot. The wooden casing began to vibrate and the dial spun on its own, cycling through station after station at increasing speed. Voices blurred together into a chorus of futures and pasts and presents all happening simultaneously. And in that moment I realized the truth that made my sanity begin to crack around the edges. The man at the gas station hadn't disappeared. He was still there, still watching, still mouthing words in sync with music only he could hear. I was the one who had disappeared, fallen into a frequency where the future was just another kind of memory, where choice was just another kind of echo. I looked up at the gas station through my windshield. The fluorescent lights still buzzed. The digital pump display still flickered. But now I could see others. Dozens of people standing motionless around the property, all holding similar radios, all mouthing silent words in perfect synchronization. They were waiting for me to turn off the engine and join them. And according to every voice still chattering from the radio in my hands, that's exactly what I was about to do. But first, I had to try one more station, one more turn of the dial, because maybe, just maybe, silence wasn't the absence of sound. Maybe silence was the moment between deciding and acting, the space where free will lived. The dial clicked into place on a station I hadn't tried before. Static filled the speaker. Then, impossibly, I heard my own voice. Not older, not programmed, but exactly as it sounded in my head when I thought my own thoughts. Turn off the radio, Tiago. Turn off the radio and drive away. My finger moved toward the power button. The future held its breath. Story 7. The fluorescent lights above the highway rest stop buzzed with that particular frequency that seemed to burrow into my skull and nest there. I'd been driving for 8 hours straight, my hands cramped around the steering wheel, my eyes burning from the endless ribbon of asphalt that stretched between Chicago and Denver. Martha had insisted we stop here, at this particular rest area somewhere in the middle of Iowa cornfields, claiming she needed to use the restroom urgently. The building looked like every other highway stop built in the 80s. Concrete block walls painted an institutional beige, windows that hadn't been cleaned in decades, and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with something I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and wrong. I waited by our car, engine ticking as it cooled, watching truckers emerge from the building with expressions that seemed oddly vacant. They moved with the mechanical precision of people going through motions they'd performed countless times before, yet something in their eyes suggested they weren't entirely present. The parking lot stretched under the weak glow of sodium lights, creating pools of sickly yellow illumination separated by vast patches of darkness. Martha had been gone for 15 minutes when I first heard it. A scream. High-pitched, desperate, unmistakably hers. The sound seemed to come from inside the building, from the direction of the women's restroom. My blood turned to ice water in my veins, and I found myself running before my conscious mind had fully processed what I'd heard. The automatic doors wheezed open, greeting me with a blast of air conditioning that carried that same unidentifiable organic smell, stronger now, almost sweet. The interior was exactly what I'd expected. Linoleum floors worn smooth by millions of footsteps, vending machines humming against one wall, and a corridor leading to the restrooms. But something was wrong with the proportions. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, stretching back into shadows that the overhead lighting couldn't quite penetrate. I called Martha's name, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves, deadened and flat. The women's restroom door stood at the far end of the corridor, and as I approached, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. A strip of silver duct tape ran along the door frame, sealing it completely shut. Stuck to the center of the door was a piece of paper with words written in black marker. "Only open if you really want to see." The handwriting wasn't Martha's. It wasn't anyone's handwriting I recognized, yet something about the formation of the letters made the hair on my arms stand up. They seemed to have been written with deliberate care, each stroke precise and calculated. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear any sound from within. Nothing. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, as though the space beyond the door existed in a vacuum. But I was certain I'd heard Martha scream. The memory of it still echoed in my ears, sharp and clear. My hands trembled as I found the edge of the tape and began to peel it away. The adhesive came off with a wet, sucking sound that reminded me of skin being separated from skin. Each inch I removed seemed to increase the pressure in my ears, as though I were ascending to a great height. The moment the seal broke completely, the door swung open on its own. Beyond was not a restroom. A corridor stretched before me, impossibly long and narrow, lit by the same buzzing fluorescent lights that somehow seemed dimmer here, creating alternating bands of harsh light and deep shadow. The walls were the same institutional beige as the rest stop, but they seemed to pulse almost imperceptibly, as though breathing. I stepped inside, calling Martha's name again. This time, my voice seemed to carry much farther than it should have, echoing back from the depths of the corridor. But as the echo returned, I realized something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't quite my voice coming back. The cadence was wrong, the pitch slightly off. It sounded like someone imitating me, someone who had studied my voice but couldn't quite capture its essence. I took another step forward, then another. The door behind me remained open, casting a rectangle of normal light that provided some small comfort. But with each step I took, that rectangle seemed to grow smaller, not because I was moving away from it, but because the corridor itself was somehow expanding. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with increasing intensity, and I began to notice that they weren't all the same. Some flickered with a rapid strobe that made my vision swim. Others had taken on a greenish tint that made everything look diseased. A few had gone out entirely, creating pockets of absolute darkness that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. 20 steps in, I called for Martha again. The echo that returned was clearer this time, more distinct. It was definitely my voice, but speaking words I hadn't said. The echo was calling for Martha too, but with a desperation that I didn't remember putting into my own voice. 30 steps. The door behind me was now impossibly far away, a tiny square of light that seemed to be receding faster than I was advancing. The corridor ahead showed no signs of ending. The walls on either side maintained their precise parallel lines, never converging, never diverging, creating a perspective that hurt to look at for too long. I turned around to go back, and my heart nearly stopped. The corridor behind me had expanded as well. The door that had been 30 steps away was now at least 100. The rectangular patch of light it cast was so small I could barely make it out. It was as though the corridor was growing in both directions simultaneously, keeping me trapped in its exact center. Panic began to claw at the edges of my consciousness. I started walking faster toward the distant door, my footsteps echoing strangely in the narrow space. The sound seemed to bounce back and forth between the walls before finally fading. But in that fading, I could hear something else. Other footsteps. Multiple sets of them, all slightly out of sync with my own. I broke into a run. The corridor stretched before me like a nightmare version of a funhouse mirror, expanding faster than I could cover ground. The door behind me became a pinprick of light, then disappeared entirely. I was alone in an endless tunnel that shouldn't exist, chasing echoes of my own voice that seemed to be leading me deeper into impossible geometry. The fluorescent lights began to strobe more rapidly, creating a disorienting effect that made it difficult to judge distance or movement. In the brief moments of darkness between flashes, I caught glimpses of other things in the corridor, shadows that moved independently of the lights, shapes that might have been other people, walking in the opposite direction with that same vacant expression I'd seen on the truckers outside. I stopped running and stood perfectly still, trying to calm my racing heart and think rationally. The silence rushed in around me, but it wasn't complete. Underneath the buzz of the lights, I could hear something else. Breathing. Not my own. This was slower, more deliberate, coming from somewhere ahead of me in the darkness. "Martha?" I called out, and again my voice echoed back distorted, carrying emotions I hadn't felt and inflections I hadn't used. The breathing stopped. In the sudden quiet, I became aware of other sounds. Distant footsteps that might have been other people trapped in other corridors. The soft whisper of air moving through spaces that couldn't exist. And underneath it all, a sound like pages turning, as though someone were reading from an enormous book. I forced myself to think about what I'd seen before entering this place. The tape sealing the door, the warning written in that careful, precise handwriting. Only open if you really want to see. The implication was clear. This was a trap, designed to catch people like me who couldn't resist investigating when someone they loved was in danger. But how many people had fallen for it? How many had opened that door and found themselves in this endless corridor, walking forever towards something they would never reach? The thought that Martha might be somewhere in this maze of impossible architecture, calling my name just as I was calling hers, filled me with a desperation that threatened to overwhelm my remaining rationality. I turned around again, hoping against hope that the door would somehow be closer. Instead, I found that the corridor behind me had changed. The walls were covered in writing now, the same careful black lettering I'd seen on the warning. Words in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They spoke of thresholds and seals, of the price of curiosity and the weight of knowledge. Among the foreign words, I began to pick out phrases in English, fragments of sentences that seemed to be instructions or warnings. The seal must be respected. To see is to be seen. The corridor feeds on pursuit, and repeated over and over in different hands. I don't want to see. Understanding began to dawn on me slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. This place, whatever it was, sustained itself on the act of pursuit. It fed on people chasing after things they'd lost, following echoes and shadows deeper into its geometry. The more desperately someone sought what they'd come for, the more the corridor would expand, keeping them always at the perfect distance from their goal. But there had to be a way out. The writing on the walls suggested that others had figured it out, had found the key to breaking free. I don't want to see. The phrase appeared so frequently it had to be significant. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I opened them again, I turned my back to the endless corridor ahead of me and began walking toward where the door had been. I didn't run this time. I didn't call for Martha. I simply walked with purpose, refusing to let my desperation fuel whatever fed on this place. "I don't want to see," I said aloud, and my voice didn't echo this time. It was absorbed immediately by the walls, accepted like a password. The corridor behind me began to contract. The fluorescent lights steadied their rhythm. The whispers and phantom footsteps faded until there was only the sound of my own breathing and the soft squeak of my shoes on the linoleum floor. I walked for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, repeating the phrase like a mantra. "I don't want to see. I don't want to see." With each repetition, the rectangle of light ahead grew larger and brighter. The walls lost their breathing quality and became simple concrete painted beige. When I finally reached the door, I stepped through without looking back and immediately began applying new tape to seal the frame. My hands shook as I worked, but I managed to create a complete seal. On a fresh piece of paper, I wrote the warning again. "Only open if you really want to see." The moment I finished, I heard a car door slam in the parking lot. I turned to see Martha walking toward the building, car keys in her hand, looking slightly confused. She stopped when she saw me standing in the corridor, tape and marker still in my hands. "There you are," she said. "I've been waiting in the car for 20 minutes. Where did you go?" I stared at her, unable to process what I was seeing. She looked exactly as she had when we'd arrived, wearing the same clothes, with the same expression of mild concern. There was no sign that she'd been in distress, no indication that she'd been anywhere but sitting in our car. "I heard you scream," I managed to say. "From the restroom." Martha frowned and looked past me toward the sealed door. "I never went to the restroom. You said you'd be right back. Then you disappeared into the building." I was starting to worry. The marker slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floor. I looked back at the sealed door, then at Martha, then back at the door. The fresh tape I'd just applied was already beginning to yellow at the edges, as though it had been there for years. "Are you feeling all right?" Martha asked, moving closer and placing a hand on my forehead. Her touch was warm and real, but something in her eyes was different. A distance that hadn't been there before, as though she were looking at me from a great height or through thick glass. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Whatever had happened in that corridor, whether it had been real or some kind of breakdown brought on by exhaustion and stress, I knew I couldn't explain it to her. How could I tell her that I'd spent an eternity in an impossible space, chasing echoes of my own voice while she'd apparently been sitting in our car the entire time? We left the rest stop in silence, Martha driving because she said I looked too tired to be safe behind the wheel. As we pulled back onto the highway, I watched the building shrink in the side mirror until it was just another anonymous structure beside the endless road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The woman beside me might look like my wife and speak like my wife, but there was something different about her presence, something that suggested she wasn't entirely there. When she spoke, her words seemed to come from slightly farther away than they should have, and when she smiled, it was with someone else's memories behind her eyes. I never told her about the corridor, and she never asked about the 20 minutes I'd been gone. We drove through the night in relative quiet, making good time toward Denver, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see that endless hallway stretching away into fluorescent-lit infinity, and I could hear the echo of my own voice calling out for something that had never been there to begin with. Sometimes, late at night when Martha was sleeping beside me, I wondered if I had really made it out of that corridor at all. Perhaps I was still walking through its endless length, following the echo of my own voice, while something else had taken my place in the world. Something that looked like me and spoke like me but lacked some essential quality that made me real. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it brought a strange kind of peace. After all, if I was still trapped in that impossible space, then at least I knew where I was. It was the uncertainty that was unbearable, the not knowing whether the world I'd returned to was the same one I'd left behind, or whether I'd simply traded one kind of prison for another. I never opened another sealed door, and I never let Martha out of my sight at highway rest stops. But sometimes, when the fluorescent lights buzz at just the right frequency, I can almost hear it again. That echo of my own voice calling out from somewhere impossibly far away, still searching for something that was never really lost. Story 8. The brass pendulum caught the afternoon light like a hypnotist's watch, and I knew I had to have it. The antique shop on Bleecker Street had always felt like stepping into someone else's memory, but that day it felt different, heavier, as if the air itself carried the weight of forgotten stories. The grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its dark mahogany case reaching nearly to the ceiling like a sentinel. The price tag dangled from its ornate hands. $800, steep for my budget, but something about its presence demanded attention. The shop owner, a wiry man with yellowed fingernails, watched me examine the timepiece with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I asked about its history, he simply shrugged and muttered something about estate sales and how some things find their way home eventually. His words stuck with me as I signed the delivery papers, though I couldn't say why. 2 days later, they installed it in my living room corner, positioning it precisely where I'd indicated, against the north wall, where the morning light would illuminate its face. The delivery men were efficient and professional, but I noticed how quickly they left, how neither looked back at the clock as they departed. That first night, the pendulum's steady rhythm became the heartbeat of my apartment. Tick-tock, tick-tock, a comforting presence that seemed to organize the chaos of city life into something more manageable. I fell asleep to its mechanical lullaby, more peacefully than I had in months. I woke to sunlight streaming through my east-facing windows and the familiar percussion of the clock marking time. But as I padded to the kitchen for coffee, something made me pause. There, on the hardwood floor directly beneath the pendulum, was a perfect circle of clean wood surrounded by a thin layer of dust. I crouched down, examining the phenomenon with the curiosity of someone still half asleep. The circle was roughly 8 inches in diameter, its edges precise as if drawn with a compass. The rest of the floor around it bore the normal accumulation of city grime. Nothing excessive, just the inevitable film that settles on everything in New York. But this circle was pristine, the wood's original honey color gleaming like it had just been polished. My first thought was logical. The pendulum's movement must create some kind of air circulation pattern that keeps dust from settling in that spot. I made a mental note to ask my physicist friend Marcus about it later, then went about my morning routine. But throughout the day, while working from my home office, I found my attention drifting to that clean patch of floor. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. The second morning brought a revelation that made my coffee cup tremble in my hands. The circle had grown. Not dramatically, maybe an inch in diameter, but undeniably larger. More disturbing still, the shape was no longer perfectly round. One edge had developed a slight indentation, creating what looked like the beginning of a curve. I spent several minutes staring at it, trying to convince myself I was mistaken, that my memory of the previous day was somehow flawed. I grabbed a measuring tape from my toolbox and documented everything. 11 inches at the widest point, 9 inches at the narrowest. The indentation was approximately 2 inches deep, curving inward like a crescent moon. I even took photographs with my phone, though the lighting made the details difficult to discern. Work became impossible that day. Every few minutes I found myself checking on the circle as if I might catch it in the act of expanding. By evening I had convinced myself I was being ridiculous. Dust patterns don't grow overnight. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps settling in the building's foundation had shifted the clock slightly, altering the pendulum's arc. But the third morning shattered any pretense of rational explanation. The clean area now resembled, unmistakably, the outline of human knees pressed against the floor in a kneeling position. The curved indentations had deepened and spread, creating 2 distinct impressions separated by perhaps 6 inches. The overall shape measured nearly 14 inches across, and the detail was becoming unnervingly specific. I could make out what appeared to be the subtle curves where kneecaps would rest, even the suggestion of fabric folds. I spent that entire day researching online, diving deep into forums about antique clocks, supernatural phenomena, and dust behavior. Most of what I found was either scientific, explanations of electrostatic forces and air circulation patterns, or utterly fantastical tales that bore no resemblance to my situation. But buried in the obscure collectors forum, I found a thread that made my blood run cold. The user, identified only as Clockkeeper47, had posted a grainy photograph of a floor beneath what appeared to be an antique grandfather clock. The image was poorly lit and out of focus, but the pattern in the dust was unmistakable. A humanoid figure, kneeling, arms extended as if in supplication or prayer. The post was dated 3 years ago, and despite dozens of replies requesting more information, Clockkeeper47 had never responded. I tried messaging the user directly, but the account appeared to be dormant. The photograph, however, bore a chilling resemblance to what was developing beneath my own clock. The proportions were different. This figure appeared smaller, perhaps a woman, but the posture was identical. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every tick of the pendulum seemed amplified, echoing through my apartment like footsteps in an empty cathedral. I found myself lying rigid in bed, straining to hear something else. some sound that didn't belong to the mechanical rhythm of gears and springs. Around 3 in the morning, I could have sworn I heard something that made me sit bolt upright, the soft whisper of fabric against hardwood, like someone shifting position while kneeling. I crept to my bedroom door and peered into the living room. The clock stood exactly where it had been, its pendulum catching occasional glints of streetlight through the windows. The area beneath it was shrouded in shadow, but I thought I detected movement, not the pendulum itself, but something at floor level, subtle as a cat's breathing. Morning brought both relief and terror in equal measure. Relief that I had obviously imagined the previous night's disturbances. Terror at what the daylight revealed. The figure was now unmistakably human in proportion. The kneeling legs were complete, joined by what appeared to be the outline of a torso bent forward in prostration. 2 arm-shaped impressions extended from where shoulders would be, reaching toward where the head would rest against the floor. The level of detail was impossible. I could make out the suggestion of fingers, the curve of a spine, even what might have been the flow of long hair pooled around an invisible head. The clean area now measured nearly 3 feet in length and almost 2 feet across at its widest point. But most disturbing was the precision of it all. This wasn't random dust displacement. It was as if someone had carefully traced the outline of a person in prayer, removing every mote of dust with surgical accuracy. I called in sick to work and spent the day photographing the phenomenon from every angle, taking measurements, even collecting samples of dust from areas surrounding the figure. Under a magnifying glass, the dust appeared normal, just the usual detritus of urban life mixed with carpet fibers and dead skin cells. The boundary between dusty and clean areas was sharp as a knife's edge, with no gradual transition that might suggest a natural explanation. By afternoon, I had developed a theory that terrified me more than any supernatural explanation. I was losing my mind. The alternative was that somehow, every night, the slow oscillation of a brass pendulum was revealing the ghostly impression of someone who had once knelt in that exact spot, praying or pleading for something I couldn't fathom. And if that were true, what would happen when the figure was complete? The thought consumed me. I researched the building's history, learning that my apartment had been built in 1923 as part of a residential hotel. The records were sketchy, but I found references to various tenants over the decades, including several mentions of religious gatherings in the building during the 1940s and 50s. One police report from 1952 mentioned a noise complaint about excessive late-night praying from apartment 4B, my apartment. That evening, I made a decision that felt both rational and completely insane. I would stay awake and watch the clock all night. If something supernatural was occurring, I needed to witness it. If I was having some kind of psychological breakdown, at least I might understand the mechanism. I positioned myself on my couch with a clear view of both the clock and the figure beneath it. Armed with coffee, energy drinks, and every electronic device I could use to document anything unusual, I settled in for what I hoped would be an enlightening vigil. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The clock kept perfect time, its pendulum swinging in the same hypnotic arc it had maintained since installation. The figure remained exactly as I had photographed it that morning. But as the night deepened, my apartment seemed to change around me. Shadows grew longer and more animated. The familiar sounds of my building, pipes settling, neighbors moving about, traffic in the street, began to sound different, more purposeful. Around midnight, I noticed that my breathing had synchronized with the pendulum's rhythm. Each swing seemed to draw air into my lungs. Each return stroke expelled it. The realization was unsettling enough that I consciously tried to break the pattern, but within minutes, I had fallen back into the same cadence. It was sometime after 2 in the morning when I first saw her. Not clearly, never clearly enough to be certain of what I was seeing. Just a translucent shimmer at the edge of my vision, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, but in my peripheral vision, I could swear I saw the outline of a woman kneeling exactly where the dust pattern indicated. Her head bowed, her arms extended in desperate supplication. I tried to photograph what I was seeing, but the camera revealed only empty floor and dancing shadows. Yet as the night progressed, the presence became stronger, more defined. I could almost make out the details of her dress, something long and plain, like a nightgown or religious habit. Her hair hung in dark curtains around her face, and though I never saw her features clearly, I had the impression of profound sorrow, of someone who had been praying for so long that the act had become part of her essential being. By 4 in the morning, I was no longer sure if I was awake or dreaming. The boundaries between what I saw directly and what I glimpsed peripherally had blurred until reality itself felt negotiable. The woman's presence filled my apartment like a low-frequency hum just below the threshold of hearing. I could sense her desperation, her endless vigil, and gradually began to understand that she was waiting for something, some response to prayers that had echoed unanswered for decades. Dawn broke with startling suddenness, and she vanished like smoke in sunlight. I blinked, shook my head, and found myself alone in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of my sleepless night: empty coffee cups, scattered photographs, pages of notes that made little sense in the morning light. But the figure beneath the clock had changed again. The outline was now complete, except for the head. Where a face should have rested against the floor, there remained only empty space, a perfect oval of accumulated dust, surrounded by the clean impression of a body frozen in eternal supplication. It was beautiful and horrible in equal measure, a prayer preserved in negative space, waiting only for completion. I understood then what would happen when the head was fully revealed. The pattern would be complete, and whatever force had been slowly manifesting through the pendulum's hypnotic motion would finally have a perfect vessel for its presence. The woman would no longer be a shimmer in my peripheral vision, but a permanent resident of my living room, kneeling forever in the space between tick and tock. The shop owner's words came back to me. Some things find their way home eventually. This had been her home once. She had knelt in this spot, perhaps nightly, pouring her hopes and fears into prayers that seemed to echo still in the building's bones. The clock wasn't creating the figure. It was revealing what had always been there, using its mechanical precision to slowly excavate a spiritual impression left decades ago. But why was it growing? And more importantly, how could I stop it? The answer came to me with the clarity of desperation. I needed to reverse the process. If the pendulum's clockwise motion was revealing the figure grain by grain, perhaps reversing its direction would cause the dust to resettle, obscuring the pattern before it could reach completion. The solution was both simple and terrifying. I would have to flip the clock, mount it upside down so that its pendulum would swing in the opposite direction. It seemed impossible that such a massive piece could be safely inverted, but the alternative was living with whatever presence would manifest when the figure was complete. I spent the morning researching clock mechanisms and pendulum physics, confirming what I hoped. Reversing the clock's orientation would indeed reverse the pendulum's arc without damaging the movement. The weight-driven mechanism would continue to function normally, just in mirror image. By afternoon, I had hired a moving company specializing in antique furniture. When I explained what I needed, the foreman looked at me as if I had requested they relocate the Statue of Liberty, but money talks, and I was prepared to pay whatever it took. The process took 3 hours and required specialized equipment to safely invert the massive timepiece. The movers were professional but clearly thought I was eccentric at best, possibly insane at worst. They kept asking if I was sure, if I understood that upside-down clocks were purely decorative, that the mechanism might be damaged. I assured them repeatedly that I understood the risks. As they worked, I watched the figure beneath the clock like a patient waiting for surgery results. With each adjustment of the massive case, I imagined I could see subtle changes in the dust pattern, as if the very act of repositioning the pendulum was already affecting whatever force had created the impression. When they finished, the clock stood exactly where it had before, but inverted. The face now hung near the floor, its Roman numerals reading like a message from an alternate universe. The pendulum, when they started it again, swung in a graceful arc from right to left instead of left to right. The movers left quickly, shaking their heads and muttering about rich people and their strange hobbies. I was alone with my upside-down clock and whatever would happen next. The change was immediate and profound. Within the first hour, I could see dust beginning to resettle over the figure. Not dramatically, just a thin film that seemed to accumulate faster than physics should allow. The sharp edges of the kneeling woman began to blur, her precisely defined limbs growing softer, less distinct. But something else was happening too. As the physical figure grew less clear, my sense of the woman's presence intensified. She no longer appeared only in my peripheral vision. Now I could sense her everywhere in the apartment, as if inverting the clock had liberated her from that single spot beneath the pendulum. I heard her moving through my rooms, the whisper of fabric, the soft padding of bare feet, the subtle sound of someone breathing just out of sight. By evening, the dust had almost completely obscured the figure, but my apartment no longer felt like my own. Every shadow seemed occupied, every silence filled with barely audible prayers. I found myself speaking aloud, addressing the empty air, asking what she wanted, what I could do to help her find peace. There was never an answer, at least not in words. But gradually, I began to understand through dreams and half-waking visions. She had lived here during the building's early years, spending her nights in prayer for a lover who had gone to war and never returned. Her vigil had lasted decades until she finally passed away, still kneeling, still hoping for word that never came. The clock had somehow preserved the spiritual imprint of her devotion, and my presence had awakened it. By reversing the pendulum, I had freed her from that single spot, but also released her into the larger space of my home. She was no longer bound to kneel beneath the timepiece, but she was also no longer bound by the physical limitations that had kept her contained. Now, 3 months later, I live with her constant presence. She doesn't harm me. In fact, I've grown oddly comforted by the knowledge that I'm not truly alone. Sometimes I wake to find my apartment tidied in ways I don't remember, my papers organized with a care I rarely show them. Other times I catch glimpses of her in reflective surfaces, always kneeling, always praying, but now mobile in her devotion. The clock still hangs upside down, its reversed pendulum marking time in a rhythm that feels more natural than it should. The dust beneath it remains undisturbed, just ordinary accumulation with no supernatural significance. But I know she's there, moving through my space like a guardian spirit, still waiting for news that will never come. I've stopped trying to convince myself that this is psychological, that grief or stress has created an elaborate hallucination. The truth is simpler and more complex than mental illness. Some forms of love are so powerful, they transcend physical death. And some prayers are so persistent, they echo through generations. The shop owner was right. Some things do find their way home eventually. But I'm beginning to wonder if the clock found me, or if I found it. And sometimes, late at night when the city grows quiet and her presence feels strongest, I wonder if maybe, just maybe, I'm the answer to prayers that have been echoing through this apartment for more than 70 years. The pendulum swings on, counting moments in reverse, and she continues her vigil. And I've learned to live with the beautiful, terrible knowledge that love and loss can leave impressions so deep they reshape reality itself, one grain of dust at a time. Story 9. The vinyl flooring installation had taken 3 days to complete, and I'd spent every spare minute of the weekend ensuring each plank aligned perfectly. The manufacturer's promises rang in my ears: premium luxury vinyl, scratch-resistant, waterproof, guaranteed to last decades. What they hadn't mentioned was how it would breathe at night. I first noticed it Tuesday evening around 11:30, when the house had settled into its familiar creaks and whispers. The living room stretched before me in the amber glow of the table lamp, the new flooring reflecting the light with an almost mirror-like sheen. That's when I saw them. Faint impressions in the vinyl surface, as if someone had walked across the room while the material was still soft. But the floor had been fully cured for days. I switched on the overhead light, flooding the room with harsh fluorescence. The impressions became more distinct under the brighter illumination, a trail of what could only be described as footprints, leading from the front door to the hallway. Each mark was roughly the size of a bare human foot, with clear indentations where toes and heel had pressed down. The pattern suggested someone had walked deliberately, purposefully, leaving behind these impossible impressions in solid vinyl. My first instinct was rational. Humidity, temperature changes, some property of the material I hadn't considered. I'd read about vinyl flooring expanding and contracting, creating bubbles or warping under certain conditions. But these weren't random deformities. These were precise, intentional marks that formed a coherent path across my living room. I grabbed my phone and took several photos, the camera flash making the impressions even more prominent. In the harsh white light, I could see details that chilled me. The slight spread of toes, the deeper impression of a heel, even what appeared to be the arch of a foot. Someone had walked through my locked house while I was at work, leaving their mark in flooring that should have been impervious to such impressions. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the house settling made me strain to listen, imagining footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with the sound of bare feet padding across vinyl, growing closer and closer to my bed. Wednesday morning brought relief. The impressions had faded considerably in daylight, becoming barely visible indentations that could easily be mistaken for minor variations in the flooring pattern. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined their clarity the night before. Almost. But Wednesday night, they returned. This time, there were more of them. The original path remained, but new impressions had appeared. A second set of footprints that seemed to branch off from the main trail, leading toward the kitchen. Under the living room's overhead light, both paths were unmistakable. I followed them with growing unease, noting how the newer impressions seemed fresher somehow, more deeply embedded in the vinyl surface. I called the flooring company Thursday morning, describing the problem as unusual indentations appearing in the material. The customer service representative listened politely before explaining that such issues typically resulted from heavy furniture placement or subfloor irregularities. When I insisted that these looked like footprints, her tone shifted to barely concealed skepticism. She scheduled a technician visit for the following week. Thursday night, the pattern expanded again. Now there were 3 distinct paths crisscrossing the living room and extending into the kitchen. The impressions appeared clearer than ever under artificial light, and I began to notice details that made my skin crawl. The footprints weren't all the same size. The original path showed larger impressions, while the newer trails contained smaller marks, though still unmistakably human in shape. I found myself studying the patterns obsessively, mapping their progression with a black marker on graph paper. The paths seemed almost choreographed, weaving around furniture and following logical routes through the space. Whoever or whatever was leaving these marks knew the layout of my house intimately. That's when I remembered the salt. My grandmother had been Portuguese, deeply superstitious, full of old-world remedies for problems both mundane and supernatural. She'd always kept salt by the doors, scattered it in corners where shadows gathered too thickly. "Salt breaks the connection," she would say in her heavily accented English. "Salt stops them from crossing over." Friday evening, I mixed coarse sea salt with warm water in a bucket, creating a solution strong enough to taste the ocean. Using a damp cloth, I began wiping down the impressions, following each footprint methodically. The vinyl cleaned easily, and under the salt water, the impressions seemed to fade more completely than they had during daylight hours. But as I worked, I noticed something that made my hands shake. The footprints weren't just random marks, they were forming a pattern. Viewed from above, the paths created what looked like a rough circle, with several trails spiraling inward toward the center of the room. The pattern was incomplete, with gaps where certain paths hadn't yet connected, but the intention was unmistakable. Something was trying to close a circuit, to complete a design pressed into my flooring. I scrubbed harder, using more salt water, watching the impressions disappear under my cloth. By midnight, the floor looked pristine again, reflecting the overhead light with its original unblemished sheen. I went to bed exhausted but hopeful that the salt treatment had solved whatever strange problem was affecting the vinyl. Saturday morning, the impressions were back, darker and more defined than ever. Not only had they returned, but they'd progressed. New sections of the spiral pattern had appeared overnight, bringing the design closer to completion. I could see where the paths would eventually connect, forming what looked like a perfect circle with intricate loops and whirls spiraling toward its center. Perhaps 3 or 4 more nights of progression would complete the pattern entirely. I spent Saturday researching vinyl flooring defects online, reading technical papers about material composition and environmental factors. Nothing I found explained impressions that appeared only at night, grew more complex over time, and resembled human footprints. The manufacturer's website contained no warnings about paranormal side effects. That evening, I decided to watch. I positioned myself in the kitchen doorway with a clear view of the living room, sitting in a chair with my back against the wall. The lights were off except for a small lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the vinyl surface. I had my phone ready to record whatever happened, though part of me hoped nothing would happen at all. The first hour passed uneventfully. Then, around 10:30, I began to notice subtle changes in the flooring's appearance. In areas where previous impressions had appeared, the vinyl seemed to develop a slight haziness, as if condensation was forming beneath the surface. The haziness spread slowly, following the established pattern of footprints. As I watched, the hazy areas began to deepen, taking on the familiar shape of foot impressions. It was like watching a photograph develop in slow motion, the marks emerging from nothing, growing more distinct as minutes passed. But there was no visible cause, no pressure being applied to the surface. The impressions simply materialized, as if something invisible was walking across my floor. My phone trembled in my hands as I tried to record, but the camera seemed unable to capture what my eyes could see clearly. In the video playback, the floor looked normal, unblemished. Only when I switched on the overhead light did the impressions become visible through the camera lens, and that's when I heard it. The softest whisper of sound, like bare skin brushing against vinyl. Not quite footsteps, too subtle, too gentle, but rhythmic and purposeful. The sound seemed to come from the floor itself, from the areas where impressions were forming. I held my breath and listened, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sounds seemed to emanate from all directions at once. As the night progressed, the pattern continued to develop. New footprints appeared following the established spiral, each one bringing the design closer to completion. I found myself hypnotized by the process, watching invisible feet press their mark into my flooring. The gentle brushing sounds continued, occasionally accompanied by what might have been the whisper of fabric or the soft exhale of breath. By dawn, another section of the spiral had been completed. Sunday, I called in sick to work and drove to 3 different stores searching for salt. I bought everything they had: table salt, sea salt, rock salt, kosher salt. I mixed it all with water in my largest bucket, creating a brine so concentrated it stung my hands. That evening, I began the ritual again, scrubbing each impression with salt water. But this time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. As I wiped away the footprints, following their path with my cloth, I could feel slight depressions in the vinyl surface. The impressions weren't just visual, they were physical indentations in the material, permanent marks that the salt water could make invisible but not eliminate. Something was actually pressing into my floor, leaving lasting impressions in solid vinyl. The salt water only masked their appearance temporarily. I worked through the night, following each path methodically, but I could feel time running out. The pattern was nearly complete now, with only small gaps remaining in the outermost spiral. When those final connections were made, when the invisible feet finished their circuit, what would happen? What would be able to step from wherever these impressions were originating into my living room? Monday night, I prepared for war. I filled spray bottles with salt water, positioned buckets of brine around the room's perimeter, and kept a damp cloth in each hand. The moment any new impressions began to appear, I attacked them with salt water, wiping them away before they could fully form. I moved frantically around the room, chasing the developing marks, trying to stay ahead of whatever force was creating them. But I was fighting a losing battle. The impressions appeared faster than I could eliminate them, and I began to notice that the salt water was becoming less effective. Marks I had just cleaned would reappear within minutes, darker and more permanent than before. Whatever was pressing these footprints into my floor was growing stronger, more determined to complete its pattern. As Tuesday dawn approached, exhaustion overwhelmed me. I sat in the center of the room, surrounded by empty salt containers and damp cloths, watching the final gaps in the spiral pattern slowly fill in. The gentle brushing sounds had grown more pronounced, almost like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. The last impression appeared just as sunlight began filtering through the windows. The pattern was complete, a perfect spiral of footprints leading inward to where I sat, surrounded by the evidence of my failed intervention. In the growing daylight, the marks became invisible again, but I could still feel the slight depressions under my hands as I traced their path across the vinyl surface. I haven't left the house since Tuesday morning. I sit here now, writing this account while waiting for night to fall again. The pattern is finished, but I don't know what that means. I don't know what will happen when darkness returns, and whatever has been pressing these marks into my floor finally completes its journey to the center of the spiral. The vinyl flooring still looks pristine in daylight, reflecting the afternoon sun with its original luster. But I know what lies beneath that perfect surface. A map pressed into the material by invisible feet, a pathway from somewhere else to here. The footprints are permanent now, embedded too deeply for salt water to affect. Tonight something will walk that completed path. Tonight something will step through. The sun is setting and I can already see the faint haziness beginning to appear in the vinyl surface. The footprints are emerging again, but this time they seem different, clearer, more solid, as if whatever is creating them has finally gained enough strength to fully manifest. I can hear the brushing sounds starting, but they're louder now, more distinct, and underneath them, something else. The whisper of breath, the gentle susurrus of fabric, the soft padding of feet that are no longer quite invisible. The flooring installation had taken 3 days to complete, and I'd spent every spare minute ensuring each plank aligned perfectly. The manufacturer had promised it would last decades. They never mentioned it would breathe at night, or that something might breathe back. Story 10. The first whisper came 3 days after I replaced the handles. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when I heard my own voice drifting from the massive oak wardrobe that dominated the far wall. The words were mine, but wrong somehow, like hearing a recording played backward, except I could understand every syllable perfectly. "Morning, this beautiful a what?" the voice murmured, and my blood turned to ice as I recognized the inverted version of what I'd said moments earlier. What a beautiful morning this is. The antique wardrobe had been Grandpa's pride, a towering monument of carved wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I inherited his house, I'd initially planned to sell the bulky piece, but something about its craftsmanship made me reconsider. The intricate carvings along its frame depicted intertwining vines and strange, elongated faces that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. It was the handles, though, that finally convinced me to make a change. The original brass handles had been tarnished beyond recognition, their surface pitted and scarred, as if subjected to decades of anxious fingers. They felt wrong under my palm, too warm, slightly sticky, like touching skin rather than metal. When I gripped them to open the doors, they seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation grew stronger each day until I couldn't touch them without feeling nauseated. So I'd driven to the hardware store and selected new handles, simple, modern chrome affairs that caught the light cleanly. The old ones had come off easier than expected, as if they wanted to be removed. I'd tossed them into a box in the basement without a second thought, eager to reclaim the wardrobe from whatever psychological hold it seemed to have over me. Now, standing in the middle of my bedroom with a half-folded shirt clutched against my chest, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. The wardrobe stood silent, its new handles gleaming innocently in the afternoon light streaming through my windows. I approached cautiously, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The air around the massive piece felt different, thicker, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening for any sound from within. Nothing. But as I pulled away, I caught a whiff of something that shouldn't have been there. The musty scent of old cologne mixed with cigarettes, a combination I recognized from childhood visits to Grandpa's house. The smell was so vivid, so immediate, that for a moment I was 8 years old again, hiding behind Grandpa's legs while he told stories about the old country. I shook my head, trying to dispel the memory. Grief did strange things to the mind. I'd learned that much during the months following Grandpa's death. The brain, desperate to hold on to the departed, could conjure their presence from the smallest triggers: a familiar scent, a play of light, the sound of settling wood. That night, I made sure to keep my bedroom door closed and spoke as little as possible while getting ready for bed. If the wardrobe was somehow echoing my words, perhaps silence would starve whatever mechanism was causing the phenomenon. I'd read about acoustic anomalies in old buildings, sound waves bouncing off surfaces in unexpected ways, creating delayed echoes or distorted reflections. There had to be a rational explanation. I was wrong about the silence helping. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. In the dim light filtering through my curtains, I could see the wardrobe's doors standing wide, revealing an interior that defied logic. Instead of my familiar clothes hanging in their usual positions, I saw garments I'd never owned: an old man's cardigan the color of dried blood, a moth-eaten fedora perched on what looked like a wooden head, and suspenders hanging like dead snakes against the back wall. But it was the arrangement that truly unnerved me. Everything was reversed, as if viewed in a mirror. Where my shirts normally hung on the left side, I saw these foreign clothes on the right. Where my shoes usually sat in neat rows on the floor, I found empty space. The very geometry of the wardrobe's interior seemed inverted, creating a space that my mind struggled to process. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The smart thing would have been to turn on the lights, to flood the room with illumination that would surely reveal the trick my sleepy mind was playing on me. Instead, I found myself drawn to the wardrobe like a moth to flame. The floorboards beneath my feet felt wrong as I approached, too soft in some places, too firm in others, as if the very foundation of my room had shifted while I slept. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying that same cologne and cigarette scent I'd noticed earlier, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. When I reached the wardrobe, I extended a trembling hand toward the hanging cardigan. My fingers passed through empty air. There was nothing there, just my own clothes hanging exactly where they should be, organized exactly as I'd left them. The foreign garments had vanished as if they'd never existed, but the doors remained open, though I was certain I'd closed them before bed. The next morning brought no relief. I called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the wardrobe's malevolent presence in my bedroom. I'd spent the night on my living room couch, but even from downstairs I could feel the thing looming above me, like a storm cloud gathering strength. I needed answers, and I knew where to start looking. Grandpa's study remained exactly as he'd left it, books and papers scattered across every surface in a system of organization that only he had understood. I'd been meaning to sort through everything for months, but the task had felt too overwhelming, too final. Now, driven by desperation, I began searching for any mention of the wardrobe. I found it in a leather journal wedged between volumes of poetry I'd never seen him read. The entries were written in his careful script, dating back nearly 60 years to when he'd first acquired the piece. The early entries were mundane: measurements, delivery details, cost. But as I read further, the tone shifted. The wardrobe remembers, he'd written in an entry from 1967. Heinrich warned me, but I thought him superstitious. Now I understand. It holds onto pieces of everyone who touches it. Their words, their clothes, their presence. All of it gets trapped inside like moths in amber. Heinrich. I remembered that name from Grandpa's stories, his older brother who'd never made it to America, who'd died in the old country during the war. According to family legend, Heinrich had been some kind of craftsman, skilled in woodworking and metalwork. I flipped through more pages, my hands trembling as the truth began to crystallize. The wardrobe hadn't belonged to Grandpa originally. It had been Heinrich's creation, a piece crafted during the darkest days of the war when hope was scarce, and people clung to whatever memories they could preserve. He built it to keep things safe, another entry read. Not just clothes, but pieces of people who might otherwise be forgotten. The handles were his masterstroke, bronze mixed with brass and something else, something that conducts more than just heat. They're the key to everything. Without them, the wardrobe becomes confused, mixing its memories, showing things that don't belong. My heart sank as I read the final entry, dated just a month before Grandpa's death. I can hear them all now, everyone who ever owned clothes that hung inside. Their voices overlap like a choir of ghosts. The handles are failing, corroded beyond repair. When they finally give out, God help whoever tries to replace them. The wardrobe won't understand the difference between memory and present, between the living and the dead. I closed the journal with shaking hands and raced to the basement, praying the old handles were still in the box where I'd carelessly tossed them. They were there, but looking at them now with new understanding, I could see they weren't simply corroded. They were covered in a patina that seemed to shift and move in the dim basement light, like oil on water. As I climbed the stairs back to my bedroom, the handles warm and strangely alive in my palms, I could hear my own voice echoing from behind the closed door. Them find must I? Means this what no to need I? The words I'd spoken in the basement, reversed and repeated back to me. I paused at my bedroom door, listening to the subtle sounds coming from within. The whisper of fabric against wood, the soft thud of footsteps that matched my own rhythm perfectly. Whatever was happening in there, it was escalating just as Grandpa's journal had warned. Soon it wouldn't just be voices and phantom clothes. Soon it would be actions, movements, an entire reflection of my life played back in reverse. I turned the doorknob slowly, the old handles growing warmer in my free hand. The wardrobe stood before me with its doors wide open, and this time the clothes inside were definitely mine. But they were moving, swaying gently as if stirred by a breeze that didn't exist, reaching toward me with empty sleeves like the arms of drowning men. As I approached, my reflection appeared in the mirror that backed the wardrobe, except it wasn't quite right. My mirror self was facing the wrong direction, moving a split second before I did, wearing clothes I'd never owned, and standing behind my reflection, barely visible in the silvered glass, was the shadow of an old man whose eyes held the weight of too many memories. I reached for the chrome handles I'd installed, intending to close the doors before reattaching Heinrich's original hardware. But as my fingers made contact with the cold metal, I heard something that stopped me cold. My own voice, speaking words I'd never said. Home going, am I, Grandpa? Peace fine to time it's. The voice was coming from my own throat, but I wasn't speaking. My lips moved without my permission, forming words in reverse that seemed to originate from somewhere deep inside the wardrobe's dark interior. And in the mirror, my reflection smiled with someone else's expression, while its eyes remained my own, confused, terrified, and completely out of control. I don't know how long I stood there, watching myself speak with my grandfather's voice while his shadow grew stronger in the glass behind me. The old handles in my left hand had grown so hot they nearly burned my palm, and I realized with growing horror that I might already be too late. The wardrobe wasn't just remembering anymore, it was absorbing, adding my words and actions to its collection of preserved moments. But there was something else in my reflection's eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Knowledge, understanding, and perhaps most terrifying of all, recognition. Because the old man's shadow in the mirror wasn't just my grandfather. It was me, 60 years older, warning my younger self about handles that couldn't be trusted, about memories that refused to stay buried, about wardrobes that remembered everything and everyone who dared to change what should never be changed. I'm writing this now with hands that shake from more than just fear, because I've realized the terrible truth Heinrich tried to preserve in his creation. The wardrobe doesn't just store clothes and memories, it stores time itself, folding it back on itself like origami made from moments that should have remained linear. The old handles are back in place now, their familiar warmth pulsing against my palm when I touch them. The whispers have stopped, and my clothes hang in their proper positions. But sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of other people in my bedroom mirror, people who owned clothes that once hung in Heinrich's wardrobe, people whose voices became part of its endless collection. And sometimes I wonder if I ever really changed the handles at all, or if that's just another memory the wardrobe has decided to play back to me in reverse, over and over, until I can no longer tell the difference between what happened and what's happening still. The handles are warm tonight, warmer than they should be. I think they're trying to tell me something. I think they're trying to tell me that I never left the wardrobe at all. Story 11. The fluorescent lights above the gas station flickered with the persistence of a dying insect, casting everything in that sickly white glow that made even familiar faces look corpse pale. I stood there pumping regular unleaded into my Honda, watching the numbers climb with the same mechanical rhythm that had become my life these past 8 months. 8 months since Sarah told me about the baby. 8 months of reading parenting books, assembling cribs, and pretending I wasn't terrified of becoming responsible for another human being. The night air hung thick with the smell of gasoline and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. Traffic on Interstate 94 had thinned to occasional headlight pairs cutting through the darkness, their Doppler-shifted hums rising and falling like electronic prayers. I glanced at my phone. 11:47 p.m. Sarah would be asleep by now, one hand resting on her swollen belly, probably dreaming of tiny fingers and first steps and all those normal things that expectant mothers dream about. We'd finally settled on a name yesterday morning. After months of debate, lists taped to the refrigerator, and countless conversations that started with, "What about?" and ended with, "No, that reminds me of your cousin who smells like cabbage." The decision had come suddenly, quietly during breakfast. Sarah had looked up from her cereal, her eyes bright with that pregnancy glow everyone talks about, and simply said it. The name, perfect and final and ours. We hadn't told anyone yet. Not her parents, not mine, not even whispered it to each other since that moment. It felt too precious, too fragile to expose to the world's opinions and associations. Names have power, Sarah had said, and I'd nodded without really understanding what she meant. The pump clicked off. I replaced the nozzle and screwed the gas cap back on, my movements automatic while my mind wandered to the nursery we'd been painting. Soft yellow walls because we'd decided to keep the gender a surprise. Sarah insisted the baby would tell us everything we needed to know when the time came. I was reaching for my wallet when I heard the truck. The air brakes hissed like a giant serpent settling into sleep, and I turned to see an 18-wheeler pulling up to the far side of the pumps. It was one of those long-haul rigs, dusty and road-worn, with mud flaps and enough chrome to reflect the fluorescent lights in fractured patterns across my retinas. The cab door opened with a metallic groan that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The man who climbed down was exactly what you'd expect from central casting for truck driver. Heavy set, wearing a baseball cap that had seen better decades, and carrying that particular weariness that comes from too many hours on dark highways. But his eyes were wrong somehow. Too bright, too focused. Like a predator that had just caught an interesting scent. I turned away, heading for the convenience store to pay, but his voice stopped me. "Excuse me, friend." The words carried an accent I couldn't place. Not quite Southern, not quite Midwestern, but something that seemed to shift and change even as he spoke. I paused, key halfway to the car door lock, and turned back. He was standing beside his truck, not moving toward me, but somehow seeming closer than the physical distance suggested. "I'm looking for a store," he said, and his smile revealed teeth that were too white, too uniform. "Heard there was one around here that sells baby names." My hand tightened on the keys. The metal cut into my palm, a sharp anchor to reality in a moment that suddenly felt adrift. Baby names? That's right. He stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of his smell. Diesel fuel and something else, something that reminded me of hospitals. Special kind of store, very exclusive clientele. They say you can find the perfect name there, one that really sticks. The way he said sticks made my skin crawl. There was something hungry in his voice, something that suggested meanings beneath meanings. I shook my head, backing toward my car. Sorry, never heard of anything like that. Are you sure? He tilted his head, and the fluorescent light caught his eyes at an angle that made them seem to glow. Because I think you might know exactly what I'm talking about. I wanted to get in my car and drive away, but something held me frozen. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me, as if he could see through my skin to something vital underneath. Maybe it was the silence that had fallen over the gas station, as if even the interstate traffic had paused to listen. I really don't know what you're talking about, I managed, but my voice sounded thin, even to my own ears. The trucker reached into his pocket and pulled out a cell phone. Not a smartphone, but one of those old flip phones that seemed impossibly ancient in the LED glow of the gas station. He opened it with a deliberate slowness that made the simple action feel ceremonial. "Let me show you something," he said, holding the phone toward me. The screen was small, maybe 2 inches across, but I could see text displayed there. Just a single word, spelled out in block letters that seemed to pulse with their own light. My heart stopped. It was the name. The name Sarah and I had chosen that morning. The name we'd told no one. The name that existed only in the space between us. Sacred and secret and ours. "Where did you get that?" The words came out as a whisper. His smile widened. "I collect them. Beautiful names, lost names, names that need new homes." He looked down at the phone, and I swear I could see the letters reflected in his pupils. "This one's particularly special, fresh, still has that new parent energy clinging to it." I felt something move in my chest, a flutter, a kick. But that was impossible. The baby was Sarah's, inside Sarah, miles away in our bedroom. I pressed my hand to my sternum, feeling for my heartbeat, but found only that strange, fluttering sensation, as if something alive was moving just beneath my ribs. "You can't," I started, but he spoke the name. He said it clearly, deliberately, with perfect pronunciation. And in that moment, the fluttering in my chest became a sharp, violent kick that doubled me over. Pain shot through my abdomen, not my own pain, but something transmitted, something shared across distance and biology in ways that should have been impossible. "Stop," I gasped, but he was already saying it again. The second repetition hit me like a physical blow. The name that had been so perfect, so right, so ours, suddenly sounded foreign in his mouth. Twisted. Wrong. Like a song played in the wrong key, or a familiar word repeated until it lost all meaning. The pain in my chest intensified, and for a moment I could swear I felt tiny hands pressing against my ribs from the inside, pushing, struggling, trying to escape something that was pulling at them from the outside. "That's two," the trucker said conversationally, as if he were commenting on the weather. "One more and it transfers completely. Amazing technology, really. Names are powerful things, identities, destinies, souls, if you believe in that sort of thing. Most people don't realize how easy they are to relocate." I understood then, with the kind of terrible clarity that comes in nightmares, what was happening. The baby, our baby, was fighting. Fighting against something that was trying to steal not just a name, but the essence that name represented. The identity we'd given our child, the future we'd imagined, the love we'd already invested in those syllables. "Please," I said, but the word came out broken. "Please don't." He raised the phone again, preparing to speak the name for the third time, and I knew with absolute certainty that if he did, something irreversible would happen. The baby would be lost to us, not dead, but unmade, unnamed, a blank space where our child should have been. That's when I remembered his truck. I lunged toward the 18-wheeler, my feet pounding across the asphalt with a desperation I'd never felt before. The truck's cab was unlocked. What kind of person leaves an unlocked truck at a gas station in the middle of the night? And I hauled myself up into the driver's seat. The interior smelled like cigarettes and that same hospital scent I'd caught from the man, but I ignored it, searching frantically for what I needed. The air horn. Every truck had one. Where was it? My hands fumbled across the dashboard, finding switches and knobs and controls I didn't recognize. Behind me, I could hear the trucker's footsteps approaching, could hear him beginning to speak that cursed name for the third and final time. There, a cord hanging down from the ceiling, ending in a grip worn smooth by countless hands. I yanked it. The horn's blast was apocalyptic in the night silence. It cut through the air like a sonic blade, drowning out everything else, including the voice that had been about to steal my child's identity. The sound seemed to go on forever, echoing off the convenience store walls and rolling across the empty parking lot like thunder. When it finally stopped, my ears were ringing, but the pain in my chest was gone. The fluttering had stopped. I sat in the cab of the truck, breathing hard, waiting for my vision to clear. The parking lot was empty. Not just empty of the trucker, empty of his truck too. I was sitting in my own Honda, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The gas pump receipt was on the passenger seat, time-stamped 11:52 p.m. 5 minutes had passed since I'd started pumping gas. I looked around wildly, searching for some sign that what I'd experienced had been real. The fluorescent lights still flickered overhead. Traffic still hummed on the interstate. Everything was exactly as it had been, except for the taste of diesel fumes on my tongue and the lingering echo of that tremendous horn blast in my ears. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Felt the baby kick just now. Strong one. Like he was trying to tell us something. Love you. I stared at the message for a long time, my hands shaking. He. She'd said he. We'd agreed not to find out the gender, but somehow she knew. Just like somehow she knew to text me at exactly this moment. I drove home through the empty streets, checking my rearview mirror constantly, but seeing only darkness. The name we'd chosen still felt right when I thought it, still felt like ours. But now it carried something else too, a weight, a knowledge that names could be taken as easily as they were given. Sarah was indeed asleep when I got home, one hand resting protectively on her belly. I slipped into bed beside her and placed my own hand next to hers, feeling for movement. After a moment, there was a gentle nudge against my palm. Not painful this time, just a baby saying hello to his father. I lay awake until dawn, listening to Sarah breathe and thinking about truck stops and fluorescent lights and the power of names. When morning came, we would need to be more careful about whom we told. We would need to protect what was ours. But as the sun crested the horizon and painted our bedroom walls gold, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, on some dark highway, a truck driver was still collecting names, still stopping at gas stations in the middle of the night, still asking helpful strangers for directions to stores that shouldn't exist. And I wondered how many other parents had stood in parking lots just like that one, fighting for their children's identities with nothing but love and desperation and the deafening blast of an air horn to save them. The baby kicked again, gentle and reassuring. I whispered his name, our name, so quietly that even Sarah wouldn't hear it in her sleep, just to make sure it was still there, still ours. It was. For now. Story 12. The GPS announced my destination with that synthetic cheerfulness that always made my skin crawl during late-night shifts. 3:47 a.m., and I was ferrying another drunk businessman back to his suburban fortress, watching the highway stretch endlessly ahead through rain-speckled windshield wipers that squeaked like dying birds. That's when I noticed the fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. The phone's blue glow showed the nearest gas station, interval 77, just 2 miles ahead. I'd been driving this route for 3 years, picking up the overflow from the airport, and I couldn't recall ever seeing a station by that name. But exhaustion played tricks on memory, and the alternative was calling roadside assistance at nearly 4 in the morning with a passenger who'd already vomited twice into my carefully positioned plastic bags. The exit appeared exactly where the GPS promised, though something about the off-ramp felt wrong. Too smooth, too perfectly curved, like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually driven a car. My headlights carved through fog that seemed to materialize from nowhere, thick and oily against the glass. Interval 77 glowed in neon letters that flickered with an unsteady rhythm, casting everything in alternating shadows of red and white. The station looked decades old, with those rounded pumps that belonged in a different era, and windows that reflected my approaching headlights in ways that made my eyes water. Two other cars sat motionless in the lot, their occupants invisible behind tinted glass. I pulled up to the nearest pump and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt oppressive, broken only by the electrical hum of overhead lights and a sound I couldn't immediately identify, like voices speaking underwater or recordings played at the wrong speed. As I stepped out, the cold hit me with unexpected intensity. My breath formed clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, and the asphalt beneath my feet felt strangely soft, almost yielding. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, sharp enough to make my sinuses burn, but underneath it lurked something else, something organic and stale, like flowers left too long in water. The station's windows glowed with warm yellow light, revealing customers moving inside with jerky, unnatural motions. I approached the door, fishing for my wallet, when the voices became clearer. They were speaking backwards, not gibberish or a foreign language, but English words reversed and strung together in sentences that my brain kept trying to decode. A woman's voice drifted through the glass. Ekin yada Eva, followed by laughter that sounded like it was being sucked back into someone's throat. I stood frozen with my hand on the door handle, listening to the impossible conversation. My rational mind offered explanations. Maybe they were playing some kind of word game, or this was performance art, or I was more tired than I'd realized and my brain was misprocessing normal speech. But the longer I listened, the more convinced I became that I was hearing genuine conversation in perfect reverse. The door chimed when I entered, a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. 3 customers stood near the counter, an elderly man in a rumpled suit, a woman with carefully styled hair that looked oddly stiff, and a teenager whose movements seemed slightly delayed, as if he were underwater. All 3 turned to look at me with expressions that were almost but not quite human. Smiles that lasted a beat too long, eyes that tracked my movement with mechanical precision. Ni vena duji, the clerk said from behind bulletproof glass, and though the words were reversed, I somehow understood them as a greeting. I nodded weakly and grabbed a bag of chips from the nearest rack, my hands shaking as I approached the counter. The clerk, a thin man with skin like old paper, continued speaking in that reversed cadence, and impossibly, I found myself beginning to understand. He was asking if I needed anything else, commenting on the weather, making the kind of small talk that gas station attendants had perfected over decades. But understanding came with a price. Each reversed word felt like a small violation, as if my brain were being rewired to accommodate this linguistic impossibility. My temples began to throb, and the fluorescent lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. I paid for my chips and the gas with trembling hands, desperate to escape the susurrus of backwards conversation that filled the store like static. The other customers watched me with those 2 bright smiles, their heads turning in perfect synchronization as I moved toward the door. Outside, the fog had thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet beyond the gas pumps. I unscrewed my fuel cap and lifted the nozzle, but something was wrong with the weight of it, too light, as if it were hollow. When I squeezed the handle, nothing happened. No click of engagement, no flow of gasoline, nothing. I tried again, checking the display screen for instructions. The numbers glowed green, showing a price per gallon, but when I looked more closely, I realized they were counting backwards. The total started at some impossibly high number and decreased with each passing second, as if the pump were sucking money from my account in reverse. That's when I noticed the other cars. They sat silent and dark, but now I could see that their fuel doors were open, and the gas cap covers lay scattered on the ground beside them. The nozzles hung from their pumps, but they were inserted backwards, not into the fuel tanks, but somehow attached to the outside of the cars, as if they were drawing gasoline out rather than pumping it in. My hands began to shake violently as understanding crept through me like ice water. This wasn't just a gas station with backward-speaking employees. This was something else entirely. a place where the fundamental rules of reality operated in reverse. I stumbled back to my car and started the engine, desperate to leave this impossible place behind. But as I pulled away from the pump, my headlights swept across a green highway sign that made my blood freeze. Mile marker 77. I'd seen that same sign when I'd taken the exit. I drove faster, following the same road that had brought me here. But within minutes, my headlights illuminated another green sign, mile marker 77. The numbers hadn't changed. According to every logical law of navigation, I should have been moving away from the station, but somehow I was traveling in a perfect loop. I tried again, this time taking mental notes of every landmark: a dead tree split by lightning, a rusted guardrail, a cluster of mailboxes. But each circuit brought me past the same mile marker, and each time I passed the station, the reversed voices seemed louder, more insistent. On my fourth loop, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. The businessman in my back seat, who had been unconscious since before I'd stopped for gas, was sitting upright now, his eyes open and staring directly at me in the rearview mirror. His lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow knew were backwards, just like everything else in this cursed place. Panic took hold then, real and primal. I floored the accelerator, pushing my sedan far beyond safe speeds on the fog-slicked road, but the mile marker appeared again and again, and each time the businessman's backwards whispers grew more audible, more urgent. That's when the terrible understanding hit me. I pulled over and fumbled for my phone, scrolling frantically through my call history. The pickup request that had brought me to this highway, it showed the passenger's name as Lena D. My own name, reversed. I spun around to look at the back seat, but it was empty. It had always been empty. The voices from the gas station made sense now, their backward syllables resolving into a pattern my exhausted mind could finally decode. They weren't speaking in reverse. I was hearing them in reverse, because I was the one moving backwards through time, through reality itself. The station employees had been trying to help me, explaining in their inverted language that this was a reflection point, a place where the normal flow of existence folded back on itself. To leave, I had to embrace the reversal completely, had to perform every action as its own opposite. I drove back to interval 77, my hands steady now despite the terror gnawing at my chest, the nozzle that had refused to pump gas into my tank. I understood now that I needed to reverse the process entirely. Instead of taking fuel from the pump, I had to give it back. With movements that felt like swimming through thick honey, I forced gasoline from my tank back into the pump, watching the numbers decrease as my fuel gauge emptied. The backward sensation was nauseating, like trying to sneeze in reverse or unswallow food. But I persisted until my tank showed empty and the pump registered a negative sale. Next, I walked backwards into the station, my feet finding the exact impressions they'd left earlier. The clerk smiled that too long smile and handed me money, the change from a purchase I was about to unmake. I placed the chips back on their rack with mechanical precision, my movements guided by some force that felt both alien and familiar. Finally, the most terrifying part. I had to drive in reverse, not just backing up, but traveling backwards along the highway itself, letting the physics of this mirror world carry me forward by moving backward. I put the car in reverse and pressed the accelerator. The world around me began to move in the wrong direction, but somehow I was making progress. The mile markers started changing, 78, 79, 80, as I drove backwards into what I desperately hoped was forward motion. The fog began to thin, and the voices faded to whispers, then to silence. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw normal highway lights ahead, and real traffic moving in the expected directions. I shifted into drive and pulled into a well-lit rest stop, my entire body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:47 a.m., the exact same time I'd left the highway to find gas. But when I checked my fuel gauge, it showed completely full. Now, 6 months later, I still drive the same route 3 nights a week. I've never seen interval 77 again, though sometimes, when the fog is thick and my exhaustion runs deep, I catch glimpses of mile marker 77 in my peripheral vision. The GPS has no record of that gas station, and when I've asked other drivers about it, They look at me with the same careful concern usually reserved for people who claim to see UFOs. Maybe it was a microsleep hallucination brought on by too many consecutive shifts. Maybe it was a stress-induced psychotic break, my mind's way of processing the monotonous isolation of night driving. The rational explanations are all there, clean and logical and reassuring. But I know what I experienced in that place where reality runs backwards. And sometimes, late at night, when the road stretches empty ahead of me, I catch myself speaking in reverse. Just single words at first, then entire phrases, as if my brain were trying to remember a language it once knew fluently. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between passengers, I wonder if I ever really left that station at all, or if I'm still there, trapped in an endless loop, convinced I've escaped while the backwards voices whisper my name in a language that makes perfect sense if you just know how to listen. The mile markers keep counting forward, but numbers can lie, and time isn't always the straight line we pretend it is. In a world where gas stations can exist in the spaces between seconds, where reality folds back on itself like origami made of light and shadow, the only certainty is uncertainty itself. And every night as I drive these same roads, I feel the pull of that impossible place. Interval 77, where everything makes sense if you're willing to let go of sense entirely, where the only way forward is backward, and where the voices that speak in reverse might be the only ones telling the truth. I just have to remember not to listen too closely because understanding comes with a price, and some knowledge is too dangerous to possess in a world that insists on moving in only one direction through time. Story 13. The migraine hit like a freight train at 3:47 p.m., splitting my skull with the precision of a surgical blade. I pulled into the first pharmacy I could find, a small, sterile-looking place wedged between a vacant lot and what might have been a laundromat, though the windows were too grimy to tell for sure. The parking lot stretched wider than it should have for such a modest building, asphalt cracked and weeping black tar in the afternoon heat. I needed something stronger than the aspirin rattling around in my glove compartment. The kind of pain clawing through my temples demanded industrial-strength relief, the sort of medication that came with warnings about operating heavy machinery and not mixing with alcohol. The automatic doors wheezed open with the sound of tired lungs, and I stepped into air conditioning that felt more like stepping into a morgue. The fluorescent lights above hummed with an electrical frequency that seemed to vibrate in my bones, casting everything in a harsh, bleached white glow that made my headache pulse harder. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. Every product on every shelf wore a blank label. Not missing labels, blank ones. Perfect white rectangles where brand names, ingredients, and warnings should have been. Rows upon rows of mysterious bottles, boxes, and packages, all stripped of identity like witnesses in a protection program. My eyes darted from shelf to shelf, searching for anything recognizable. Pain relievers, cold medicine, vitamins. Everything looked generic, sterile, wrong. The bottles were the right shape, the boxes the correct size, but it was as if someone had taken an eraser to reality itself. A man behind the counter watched me with the patient expression of someone accustomed to confused customers. He was neither young nor old, with features so average they seemed computer-generated. His name tag was blank too. I approached the counter, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The place felt larger inside than it had appeared from the parking lot, with aisles stretching back farther than they should have, disappearing into shadows that the fluorescent lights couldn't quite penetrate. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding strangely muffled. "I'm looking for something for a headache. Strong stuff." The cashier's smile was perfectly symmetrical, like it had been measured. He gestured toward the back of the store without breaking eye contact. "Aisle 7, though you might want to check aisle 9 first. We just got some new lighting installed. Sometimes it affects how people see the labels." New lighting. I glanced up at the same fluorescent tubes that had been humming since I walked in, their harsh white glow unchanged, but I nodded and headed toward the back of the store, past rows of blank products that seemed to multiply as I walked. Aisle 7 stretched longer than it should have. The shelves rose higher than I remembered, creating narrow corridors that felt more like passages in a maze than a simple pharmacy layout. Every bottle I picked up was the same. Smooth white label, no text, no indication of what might be inside. I shook one, and pills rattled inside. But they could have been anything from antacids to antibiotics. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. In that brief moment of dimness, I could have sworn I saw text on the labels, ghostly impressions of words that vanished the instant the lights stabilized. My headache pounded harder, and I found myself moving toward aisle 9 almost without thinking. The cashier's suggestion echoed in my head with the persistence of a song stuck on repeat. New lighting, as if lighting could erase words from paper. Aisle 9 was identical to all the others, blank labels stretching into the distance like a paper cemetery. But something made me pause at the far end, where the fluorescent lights cast deeper shadows. There, on the bottom shelf, partially hidden behind a row of larger bottles, sat a small orange prescription bottle, with text on the label. I grabbed it with hands that had started to shake, though I told myself it was just the caffeine withdrawal. The label was perfectly normal, typed text, pharmacy logo, patient information. Generic name, acetaminophen. Patient, L. Morrison. Take as needed for pain, L. Morrison. Lucas Morrison. My name. But I hadn't filled any prescriptions here. I'd never even seen this place before today. The bottle felt warm in my palm, almost alive. I turned it over, examining every detail. The pharmacy's name, Morrison's Pharmacy, seemed to pulse slightly, as if the letters were breathing. Even stranger, the address listed was my home address, not the location of this building. I looked around the aisle, but the perspective seemed wrong now. The shelves stretched impossibly far in both directions, and the ceiling had somehow grown higher while I wasn't paying attention. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, their frequency climbing to an almost subsonic whine that made my teeth ache. Walking back to the front of the store felt like moving through thick water. Each step required conscious effort, and the distance seemed to expand with every movement. The cashier remained at his post, still smiling that perfect, measured smile. "Find everything you need?" he asked, though I noticed his lips didn't quite match the timing of his words. I held up the orange bottle. This is my prescription." "Of course it is." His smile never wavered. "That'll be $15. I paid with bills that felt too crisp, too new, as if they'd just been printed. The cashier's fingers were cold when they brushed mine during the exchange, and I noticed he cast no reflection in the security mirror mounted above the register. Outside, the parking lot stretched even wider than before. My car sat alone in the center of an expanse of cracked asphalt that seemed to extend to the horizon. The sky had taken on the color of old television static, gray and white pixels shifting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I clicked the key fob, and the car's lights flashed in response. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't turn over, didn't even attempt to start. The dashboard lights came on, the radio crackled to life, but the car remained dead. That's when I noticed the mirrors. In the rearview mirror, the parking lot was empty. Not just of other cars, but of everything. No pharmacy, no building, just endless gray asphalt stretching into a featureless distance. But when I looked through the windshield, I could see the pharmacy clearly, along with other buildings that definitely hadn't been there when I'd arrived. I checked the side mirrors. Empty parking lot. Looked through the side windows. Busy street, complete with traffic, pedestrians, other businesses. The contradiction made my headache surge, and I pressed the heels of my palms against my temples. The orange prescription bottle sat on the passenger seat, somehow having escaped the bag. In the strange light filtering through the windshield, the text on the label seemed to shift and move, letters rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I picked up the bottle and examined it again. The pharmacy name had changed. Instead of Morrison's Pharmacy, it now read Simulacrum Station. The address was a string of numbers that didn't correspond to any numbering system I recognized. My name was still there, but the generic name had changed to something I couldn't pronounce. a combination of letters that seemed to hurt my eyes when I tried to focus on them. The fluorescent lights in the pharmacy flickered again, visible through the glass doors. In that moment of dimness, I saw movement inside. Shapes that might have been people or might have been shadows, moving between the aisles with purpose that seemed disconnected from any normal shopping behavior. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. The key turned. The electrical systems responded, but the engine remained silent. It was as if the car existed in a state of partial reality, functional in some ways, but fundamentally disconnected from the basic physics that should make it run. The prescription bottle grew warmer in my hand, and I could hear something inside. Not the rattle of pills, but something else. A sound like distant whispers, or maybe static from a radio tuned between stations. I unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers. Inside were tablets, but they weren't white like acetaminophen should be. They were translucent, like small windows into somewhere else. When I held one up to the light, I could see movements inside, tiny scenes playing out like movies in miniature. Streets that looked familiar but wrong, buildings that almost matched my neighborhood but with details that didn't quite fit. The whispers grew louder when I held the tablet closer to my ear. Words in a language that sounded like English spoken backward, or maybe forward, but with the meaning drained out. I understood somehow that these weren't medications at all, but something else entirely. The fluorescent lights in the pharmacy went out completely, then came back on one by one, like a slow-motion strobe effect. With each flash, the building seemed to shift slightly, as if someone was adjusting the focus on reality itself. The parking lot around my car began to ripple, asphalt flowing like water, creating patterns that spiraled inward toward my vehicle. I understood now that the car wouldn't start because it couldn't start. Not here, in this place that existed in the spaces between normal reality. The pharmacy wasn't a pharmacy at all, but something masquerading as one, a trap disguised as convenience. The blank labels weren't the result of new lighting. They were the natural state of things here, where brands and identities had no meaning. But the prescription bottle was different. It was a key, a bridge, a ticket back to the world where cars started and labels had words and mirrors showed the same thing as windows. The translucent tablets weren't medication. They were pieces of reality itself, concentrated and distilled into something I could swallow. The whispers from the bottle grew more insistent, and I began to understand what they were saying. Instructions, spoken in that backward English, telling me what I needed to do. Take one tablet, hold it under my tongue until it dissolved. Think about the exact moment I'd decided to pull into this parking lot and choose differently. But the voice was also warning me about something else, about the cost of leaving this place, about what I'd have to give up to return to a world where things made sense. Reality had a price, and the payment wasn't always obvious until after the transaction was complete. I looked through the windshield again. The street beyond showed normal traffic, normal people going about their normal lives. Through the mirrors, I saw only emptiness stretching to infinity. Two versions of the world existing simultaneously, overlapping but never quite touching. The fluorescent lights continued their slow strobe, and with each flash, the pharmacy seemed to grow larger, its walls stretching outward like a building breathing. The empty parking lot in the mirrors began to fill with cars, vehicles from different eras, all sitting silent and motionless like mechanical fossils. My headache had disappeared completely, I realized. Sometime during this impossible experience, the pain that had driven me here in the first place had simply evaporated. Maybe that was the real function of this place, not to sell medicine, but to cure ailments by replacing them with something else entirely. A headache traded for existential confusion, pain swapped for terror. The prescription bottle felt lighter now, as if the tablets inside were losing mass, becoming more concept than substance. I could feel time moving strangely here, seconds stretching like taffy, while minutes collapsed into themselves. How long had I been sitting in this parking lot that existed and didn't exist simultaneously? I thought about the cashier's perfect smile, his blank name tag, his lack of reflection, about the impossibly long aisles and the shadows that gathered at their ends, about the way the building had grown larger when I wasn't paying attention, as if it fed on distraction and uncertainty. The translucent tablet felt warm against my palm as I held it up to examine more closely. The tiny scenes playing out inside had changed. Now they showed my car starting normally, me driving away, arriving home to my normal life where pharmacy labels had words and mirrors told the truth. But they also showed other scenes, darker ones, where I remained here forever, becoming another blank figure moving through endless aisles of unlabeled products. The choice was mine, the whispers explained. I could take the tablet and return to my reality, but I would carry this place with me forever, a memory that would never quite fit with the rest of my experiences, a constant reminder that the world was far stranger and more fragile than I'd ever imagined. Or I could stay, become part of this simulacrum, existing in the spaces between what was real and what was possible. The fluorescent lights flickered one final time, and in that moment of darkness, I made my decision. When the lights came back on, the pharmacy was gone. Or maybe it was never gone. Maybe I was simply looking at it from a different angle, seeing it as it truly was instead of how it wanted to be seen. The parking lot remained, but now it felt more like a stage set than a real place. All facades and false fronts designed to create an illusion of normalcy. I sat in my car, engine still silent, holding a prescription bottle that might have contained salvation or damnation. The tablets inside continued their whispered promises, offering me a way back to the world I thought I knew. But they couldn't guarantee that world would be exactly the same. Reality, once disturbed, had a tendency to remain slightly off-kilter, like a picture hanging crooked that could never quite be straightened. The mirrors showed emptiness. The windows showed life. And somewhere between those two truths, I had to decide which version of reality I was willing to live with. The prescription bottle grew heavier in my hand, its weight increasing with each moment of indecision. Soon I knew the choice would be made for me. The simulacrum was patient, but it wasn't eternal. Eventually, it would need to return me to my world, or claim me for its own. I looked at the tablet one more time, watching the tiny scenes play out inside its translucent surface. My normal life beckoned from within that small window, but it looked somehow smaller now, more constrained, as if I'd been living in a house and only now realized how narrow the rooms really were. The whispers grew softer, more distant, as if the voice was growing tired of waiting for my decision. The fluorescent lights in the pharmacy, visible or invisible, real or imagined, continued their eternal hum, a sound that I suspected I would carry with me wherever I went, whatever choice I made. In the end, the decision felt less like choosing between two realities and more like choosing between two different kinds of uncertainty. The familiar uncertainty of a normal world that might not be as stable as it appeared, or the honest uncertainty of a place that admitted its impossibility from the start. I held the tablet beneath my tongue and waited for reality to decide what it wanted to be. Story 14. The interstate stretched ahead, like a black tongue licking at the horizon, and I should have kept driving. Should have trusted that gnawing sensation in my gut that whispered something's wrong as the fuel gauge needle kissed empty. But Nina needed water, and I needed coffee, and the neon sign bleeding red letters into the October darkness promised both at Casey's Corner, a gas station that looked like it had been transplanted from 1987 and forgotten by time. I pulled into the harsh fluorescent glow that made everything look diseased. The overhead lights buzzed with that particular frequency that burrows into your skull and stays there, a metallic hum that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. Nina stirred in the passenger seat, her golden retriever ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. She'd been restless for the last 50 miles, panting despite the cool air conditioning, her dark eyes darting to the windows as if tracking movement in the empty fields. The silence when I cut the engine felt thick, almost viscous. Even the usual cricket symphony was absent, replaced by nothing but that insistent buzzing and the distant whisper of wind through dying grass. I scratched Nina behind the ears, feeling the dampness of her fur despite the cool night. She leaned into my touch but kept glancing toward the station's entrance, where shadows pooled beneath a flickering awning light. I was halfway to the door when he materialized from those shadows. The man was perhaps 60, maybe older, the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many nights spent under bridges and too many meals skipped. His clothes hung loose on a frame that suggested he'd once been larger, more substantial, but it was his eyes that made me pause. They held an urgency that seemed disproportionate to simple hunger or the need for loose change. "Got anything warm to spare?" His voice carried a rasp that spoke of cigarettes and harsh winters. "Doesn't have to be much, just something with a strong smell to it." The phrasing struck me as odd. Not warm clothes, not a jacket, something with a strong smell. I found myself studying his face more carefully, noting how his gaze kept drifting past me toward my Honda, toward Nina's silhouette visible through the windshield. "Sorry, man. Don't have anything extra." The lie came easily, though I had a fleece jacket in the trunk that I rarely used. Something about his intensity made me reluctant to engage further. "But there's probably someone inside who could help." He nodded, but his expression suggested he'd expected my refusal. "That's all right. Just, you might want to keep moving tonight. Sometimes this place gets visitors after midnight, the kind that don't show up on cameras." Before I could ask what he meant, he melted back into the shadows with surprising grace for someone his age. I glanced at my watch. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until whatever he was warning me about. Inside, the station held that peculiar stillness of liminal spaces, too bright, too quiet, existing in a pocket outside normal time. The clerk, a woman with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes, barely glanced up from her magazine. The coffee was the consistency of motor oil, but I bought it anyway, along with a bottle of water for Nina and a package of gas station sandwiches that would serve as tomorrow's breakfast. As I paid, the woman's eyes found mine with startling intensity. "You're not planning to stick around, are you?" The question caught me off guard. "Just getting gas and moving on." She nodded approvingly. "Good. After midnight, this place attracts attention. Best to be gone before then." 2 warnings in 10 minutes. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations. Drug dealers, dangerous transients, local kids causing trouble. But something in both their tones suggested they weren't talking about conventional dangers. Outside, the air had developed a thickness that hadn't been there before, as if humidity was rising despite the clear sky. Nina was pressed against the passenger door window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared fixedly at something beyond my perception. Her body was rigid with attention, the way she looked when she spotted squirrels in our backyard. But there were no squirrels here, nothing visible at all. As I approached the car, she began to growl, a low, continuous rumble that seemed to emanate from deep in her chest. The sound raised goosebumps along my arms. In 8 years together, I'd only heard her growl twice. Once at an aggressive dog in the park, and once at a stranger who'd approached our campsite at 3 a.m. with intentions that felt all wrong. "What is it, girl?" I followed her gaze but saw only empty asphalt and the dying grass beyond the station's circle of light. That's when I noticed the mist. It started as wisps, barely visible threads of vapor that could have been my imagination or breath on cold air. But the temperature was in the mid-60s, too warm for visible breath, and these tendrils moved with purpose rather than following wind patterns. They seemed to emanate from the ground itself, rising in delicate spirals before dissipating into the fluorescent bright air. Nina's growling intensified, her hackles rising as she tracked something I couldn't see. Her eyes moved in jerky, specific patterns, as if following a distinct form rather than random mist. I found myself mimicking her gaze, trying to see what captured her attention so completely. The mist began to coalesce. At first, it was just denser patches, areas where the vapor gathered and held rather than dispersing. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, these patches began to suggest familiar shapes. The curve of a spine, the angle of a shoulder, the distinct outline of a dog's pointed ears. My mouth went dry as understanding hit me. The mist wasn't random. It was forming the approximate shape of Nina. The vaporous duplicate stood about 15 feet away, mimicking my dog's posture with unsettling accuracy. It held the same alert stance, the same angle of head tilt. When Nina shifted her weight from one paw to another, the mist thing followed suit with a delay of perhaps half a second, like a poor video connection struggling to sync audio and visual. But it wasn't quite right. The proportions were slightly off, as if someone was working from a description rather than direct observation. The legs were too long, the torso too narrow. It was Nina viewed through a funhouse mirror, recognizable but fundamentally wrong. I blinked hard, hoping to clear my vision, to reveal this as some trick of late-night fatigue and fluorescent lighting. But when I opened my eyes, the shape was more distinct, more solid, and it was moving closer. Nina's growling escalated to a pitch I'd never heard from her, a sound of pure territorial aggression mixed with something that might have been fear. She pressed herself against the far door, as far from the approaching shape as the car's interior allowed. Her eyes never left the mist double, tracking its approach with the focused intensity of prey watching a predator. The thing moved wrong. While it maintained Nina's general shape, its locomotion felt off, as if someone unfamiliar with quadrupedal movement was attempting to replicate it. The gait was stilted, mechanical, each step placed with deliberate consideration rather than natural flow. As it drew nearer, I caught something else that made my stomach lurch. The mist wasn't just copying Nina's shape. It was trying to copy her scent signature. I could smell it attempting to replicate the warm, familiar odor of her fur, but the result was all wrong. Instead of Nina's clean, slightly sweet smell, this carried undertones of decay and dampness, like clothes left too long in a washing machine. The realization hit me with crystalline clarity. This thing learned through scent. It was studying Nina, trying to absorb the olfactory information that would allow it to become a perfect copy. And once it succeeded, I thought of the vagrant's odd request for something with a strong smell, and suddenly understood. He'd been trying to confuse it, to give it conflicting scent information that would scramble its ability to lock onto a target. Moving slowly to avoid startling either Nina or the approaching apparition, I reached into the back seat where I kept emergency supplies. My fingers found the plastic package containing clean sheets, laundry I'd been meaning to drop off at my apartment. The fabric was fresh from the commercial washing, carrying only the neutral smell of industrial detergent. The Miss Nina was close enough now that I could see details in its construction. It wasn't solid, but rather a dense gathering of vapor, constantly shifting and reforming. Occasionally, portions would drift away, only to be drawn back by some invisible force. Its eyes were the worst part, empty spaces in the mist that nonetheless seemed to track my movements with predatory intelligence. Nina's growling had become almost continuous now, a vibration I could feel through the car's frame. Her entire body was rigid with terror and aggression, caught between the instinct to flee and the need to defend her territory. I unwrapped the clean sheet, the plastic crinkling loud in the tense silence. The mist thing paused in its approach, its approximation of Nina's head tilting in what might have been curiosity. For a moment, I wondered if I was about to make a terrible mistake, if interfering with whatever was happening would escalate the situation beyond control. But as the vapor double took another step closer, close enough that I caught a stronger whiff of its wrong smell, I acted. I threw the sheet over Nina. The effect was immediate and startling. The clean fabric, carrying no scent signature beyond neutral detergent, seemed to erase Nina from the thing's perception entirely. The mist shape froze mid-step, its head swiveling in apparent confusion. Without Nina's scent to anchor it, the vaporous form began to lose cohesion. The outline wavered, edges blurring as if someone was adjusting the focus on a camera. The thing's attempts to maintain its canine shape became increasingly frantic, vapor swirling in tighter and tighter spirals as it searched for the olfactory anchor that had suddenly vanished. Then, with no warning, it collapsed. The mist dispersed in all directions, scattering on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Within seconds, there was nothing left but ordinary water vapor, dissipating into the night air as if it had never held any particular shape at all. Under the sheet, Nina had gone completely still. I could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow, but the growling had stopped. When I carefully lifted a corner of the fabric, Her eyes found mine immediately, wide, alert, but no longer tracking invisible threats. The station's fluorescent lights continued their metallic buzz. The wind whispered through dead grass. A truck rumbled past on the interstate, its taillights disappearing into the darkness like dying embers. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be. I sat in my car for another 10 minutes, engine running, watching for any sign of returning mist. Nina remained calm under her makeshift shroud, occasionally shifting position but showing none of her earlier agitation. Gradually, the tension in my shoulders began to ease. By the time I pulled back onto the interstate, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by too much driving and too little sleep. Late-night fatigue playing tricks on an overworked mind. A perfectly rational explanation for an irrational experience. But Nina wouldn't come out from under the sheet. Even when we stopped for breakfast the next morning, she insisted on keeping the fabric draped over her head and shoulders like some canine monk's robe. When I tried to remove it, she would press herself against the floor of the car, making soft whimpering sounds that spoke of terror rather than discomfort. It took 3 days before she would venture outside without her protective covering. And even now, months later, she still sleeps with that sheet pulled over her head, one corner clutched between her teeth as if it were a talisman against things that hunt by scent in the darkness between midnight and dawn. I tell myself it was just a shared delusion, a folie à deux between an overtired man and his anxious dog. But sometimes, when we pass gas stations late at night, Nina will suddenly stop and stare at empty spaces, her nostrils flaring as she tests the air for scents that might not belong to anything living. And I find myself checking the back seat to make sure her sheet is still there, clean and neutral, and ready to hide her from things that wear the shapes of what they smell. Because what if the vagrant was right? What if some places attract visitors after midnight? The kind that don't show up on cameras but hunt by olfactory signature alone. What if they're still out there waiting for the next traveler who stops at the wrong place at the wrong time, with a beloved companion whose scent could teach them how to wear the perfect disguise? I keep driving past gas stations now, even when the tank shows empty, because some risks aren't worth taking twice, and some questions are better left unanswered in the safety of daylight miles from Casey's Corner and its flickering lights. But late at night, when Nina whimpers in her sleep and burrows deeper under that sheet, I wonder if we really escaped at all, or if we just taught something how to be more patient. Story 15. The basement door had been hanging crooked for 3 weeks when I finally decided to replace it. Not dramatically crooked, just enough to catch my eye every time I passed, just enough to make the house feel slightly wrong, like a picture frame tilted a degree off center. The old door had warped from years of humidity, and the frame had settled unevenly, creating a gap that let cold air seep upstairs and carry with it the musty scent of concrete and forgotten storage boxes. I bought a standard pre-hung door from the hardware store, confident in my ability to install it properly. I'd done this kind of work before. Measure twice, cut once, level the frame, check the swing, adjust the hinges. Simple carpentry that should have taken an afternoon. But when I removed the old door and frame, I discovered the foundation had shifted more than I'd realized. The opening was skewed by several millimeters, not enough to be obvious to a casual observer, but enough to make a perfect installation impossible without major reconstruction. I could have torn out the entire frame, re-squared the opening, patched the walls, but that would have meant days of work, dust throughout the house, and expenses I couldn't justify for a basement door. So I compromised. I shimmed and adjusted until the door hung reasonably straight, accepting that it would never be perfect. The latch caught properly, the hinges moved smoothly, and from a distance it looked fine. Only when you stood directly in front of it could you notice the hairline gap along the top edge where the door didn't quite meet the frame. A gap so narrow you could barely slide a business card through it. That first night, I descended the basement stairs to check my work one final time. The door closed with a satisfying click, the latch engaging cleanly. I tested the handle, locked securely. I turned off the basement light and climbed back upstairs, pleased with the day's work despite the minor imperfection. The next morning I found the door standing slightly ajar, not wide open, just barely separated from the frame. The gap that had been at the top was now evenly distributed around the entire perimeter, as if the door had somehow shifted overnight to hang perfectly plumb. I examined the hinges, the latch, the frame itself. Everything appeared normal, yet the alignment had clearly changed. I must have failed to latch it properly, I reasoned. The door had simply swung open on its own. I closed it again, this time pressing firmly to ensure the latch engaged completely. The mechanism clicked decisively into place. The following morning brought the same result. The door hung ajar, perfectly aligned within its frame. This pattern continued for a week. Each evening I would close the door securely, testing the latch multiple times. Each morning I would find it slightly open, the alignment mysteriously corrected. I began to question my installation, wondering if the frame was somehow still settling, if thermal expansion was causing the wood to shift during the night. But wood doesn't move that precisely. Wood doesn't correct itself with such mathematical accuracy. On the 8th night, I decided to observe the phenomenon directly. I closed the door as usual, then positioned myself on the stairs where I could watch without being seen. The basement remained dark, illuminated only by the thin line of light that seeped around the imperfectly fitted frame. For an hour, nothing happened. The door remained closed, motionless. My legs began to cramp from sitting on the narrow steps, and I started to feel foolish for entertaining whatever paranoid notion had driven me to this vigil. Doors don't move by themselves. There had to be a rational explanation. Air pressure changes, settling foundation, something mundane and logical. Then, just as I was about to give up and go to bed, I heard it. A sound so soft I initially thought I'd imagined it. The whisper of wood against wood. The door was moving, separating from the frame with glacial slowness. No sudden swing, no creak of hinges, just a gradual, deliberate opening that took nearly 10 minutes to complete. When it stopped, the door hung in that same mysterious, perfect alignment, the gap evenly distributed around its perimeter. I remained frozen on the stairs, afraid to move, afraid to investigate further. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. A draft, a loose hinge, something mechanical and understandable. But the growing knot in my stomach suggested otherwise. Through the now visible gap, I could see into the basement. The familiar shapes of storage boxes, old furniture, the water heater humming quietly in the corner. Everything exactly as I'd left it, yet somehow different. The shadows seemed deeper, the angles slightly off. When I'd installed the door, the workbench had been positioned against the far wall. Now it appeared to be several inches to the left. I descended the remaining steps, switching on the overhead light. The basement looked normal, completely, utterly normal. The workbench was exactly where it had always been, flush against the wall. The storage boxes occupied their usual positions. Nothing was out of place. But when I reached for the door to close it, I noticed something that made my hands tremble. Through that narrow gap between the door and frame, I could still see the basement. But in that sliver of visible space, the workbench was positioned several inches to the left. I was looking at the same room from the same angle, yet seeing two different arrangements simultaneously. Through the gap, the basement contained furniture positioned differently than the basement I was standing in. I slammed the door shut, engaging the latch so forcefully the entire frame shook. Then I ran upstairs and spent the rest of the night pacing the living room, trying to convince myself I'd been seeing things. Fatigue, stress, an optical illusion created by the odd angle and dim lighting. People don't see alternate versions of their own basements through crooked doorways. Such things don't happen in the real world. But the next morning, the door was ajar again. This time I forced myself to look through the gap deliberately. The basement I could see through that narrow opening was almost identical to my own, but with subtle differences. The workbench was indeed positioned differently. A cardboard box I'd labeled Christmas decorations was missing from its usual spot. The old recliner I'd inherited from my father sat at a slightly different angle. Over the following days, these differences became more pronounced. Through the gap, I began to see a basement that was unmistakably mine, yet increasingly foreign. Books were arranged differently on the metal shelving. Tools hung in altered configurations on the pegboard. The concrete floor showed different stains, different wear patterns. I started keeping the door wedged shut with a rubber doorstop, but each morning I would find the wedge pushed aside, lying on the floor several feet away. I installed a sliding bolt lock, only to discover it somehow disengaged overnight. I even tried jamming a wooden chair under the handle, but the chair would be found neatly positioned against the wall, as if someone had carefully moved it aside. The door wanted to open. More than that, it needed to open, as if maintaining that gap was essential to some process I couldn't understand. 3 weeks into this nightmare, I began to notice changes in my own basement. Subtle at first, a tool that wasn't quite where I'd left it, a box that seemed to have shifted slightly, but gradually these alterations became more obvious. Items disappeared entirely, only to be replaced by similar but not identical objects. My red toolbox became black. A photo I'd taped to the wall showed different people, though they bore an unsettling resemblance to my family. The basement was changing, conforming to what I could see through the gap. Or perhaps I was losing my mind, and the gap showed only what my deteriorating psyche expected to see. I researched everything I could about dimensional theory, parallel realities, quantum mechanics, desperately seeking any framework that might explain what was happening. I found plenty of speculation, but nothing that addressed doors that opened onto alternate versions of the same space. I considered calling a priest, a psychiatrist, a contractor, who might simply replace the entire doorway. But how could I explain any of this without sounding completely insane? Then I realized the true horror of my situation. Through the gap, I had never seen myself. In all my observations of that other basement, I had never glimpsed my own reflection, never spotted movement that corresponded to my own actions. The basement through the gap was always empty, always still. But if I was looking at an alternate version of my own space, where was the alternate version of me? That night I positioned myself to watch through the gap while holding a mirror angled to reflect my own image. What I saw in the reflection made my blood freeze. In the mirror, I could see myself standing in my basement, holding the mirror. But through the gap, I could see the same basement, empty. The person holding the mirror didn't exist in that space. I was the difference between the two versions. I was the element that didn't belong. As this realization struck me, I noticed the gap beginning to narrow. The door was moving again, but this time it was closing. The perfect alignment was trying to assert itself, trying to eliminate the discrepancy between the two spaces. If the door closed completely, if the alignment became perfect, which version would become real? The basement where I existed or the one where I didn't? I grabbed the first object I could find, a screwdriver from my toolbox, and jammed it into the gap just as the door was about to meet the frame. The metal tool held the door open by the barest margin, maintaining that crucial imperfection that seemed to be the only thing keeping me anchored to my own reality. But the pressure was enormous. I could feel the door straining against the screwdriver, trying to close, trying to complete its alignment. The metal was bending under the force. I need to fix the frame. I need to resin the hinges, lock the door in its crooked position permanently. But every time I try to work on it, I can feel reality shifting around me, trying to choose between two versions of the same space. And I'm starting to wonder, what if the version where I don't exist is the real one? What if I'm the anomaly, the glitch that's preventing the world from correcting itself? Through the gap, I can see my basement as it should be, empty, peaceful, undisturbed by the paranoid observations of someone who may or may not actually exist. The screwdriver is bending more each day. Soon it will snap, and the door will close, and the alignment will be perfect. I just hope I'll still be here to see what happens next. Or maybe I hope I won't be.